of colonialism. So the Prince William and his wife went down to the Caribbean islands last weekend, and they went to Jamaica, Belize, and the Bahamas. And there were a lot of really tough moments. And I saw the Jamaican Prime Minister giving him a bottle of Appleton, which is really, really concentrated rum. And then he takes him in a room and tells him that we don't want to be part of the Commonwealth anymore. You know,
right.
Jamaica wants to be a republic. And that wasn't lost on me and my sister. Said, oh, we're going to get him drunk and then convince him. You know, right?
Well, I actually find a somewhat of a problem with the division, even though I agree with it, because I find that the transition between the ancient and the medieval, transition between the medieval and the modern, and actually the transition of the modern into something else is a more important period than the period itself.
Yes.
So, like, I think to a certain degree we're covering that, but we're not covering it in the sort of detail as in a sense, the middle part.
Right. Yeah.
Well, I agree.
Go ahead, Sharon.
Well, I said, I agree with you, Phil. And for a non-philosopher, this is all fascinating because what I'm seeing to my very pragmatic mind is repetitive behavior. Right. And so I'm seeing what springs to mind is that history repeats itself, particularly if you don't know it, So colonialism might have gone, but it's still in the DNA. So therefore, the behavior is still left to be expressed.
Right.
Well, that's part of the hermeneutic circle. Really.
Part of the what?
The hermeneutic circle. In other words, you keep going around, and the basic stuff is there, and you have to be able to sort it out and interpret it. And that's why you go around and around, because you only get a little bit of it, and then it makes a little bit more sense and a little bit more sense as you go around it. So it is confusing in the first go around because everything is new. Like, what the hell is this all about? And then the next time you recognize what that was, and now you digest some more. And so you have to go round and around and gather more and more and actually connect more and more relationship between all the stuff that are confusing, and then you begin to get it. So that means it really is in our mind that we don't understand. I mean, it's always kind of been there, but we don't understand it.
So I agree with you. I think us moderns, we're still eating. We haven't gotten to the digestion part yet. If not, we wouldn't repeat the behavior.
Right.
And forgive the analogy. That's just what I think.
That's a great one. That's a great one.
That's just what I think. And so that's why I wanted the rest of these essays, so I could see what Kenneth Smith's thoughts were.
Yeah. There's layers and layers to this thing. It's like, first, getting the whole idea that examining your life instead of taking it for granted is a good thing, that has to overcome a whole bunch of resistance as an idea, right? Because, think of how many times have you seen those internet tests, here's this thing, just give your first answer, don't think about it. Or live as though each day is your last. Or there's this endless line of bumper stickers that tell you the unexamined life is the only life worth living. And if you think too much, it's bad, and you should not do that. And then when you look at the powers of society and the way it's structured, if you think hard about things and you come up with observations about things that ought to change, you discover nobody's impressed. In fact, on the contrary, you get an enormous amount of pushback if you start saying things like, maybe we should break up segregation, or maybe slavery is a bad idea. There are violent responses to people, investigating these things and pushing back against these things. So just even to get to that first level of, is it okay to think about things? Question things. We discover, modernism gives this answer. Of course, you can think about anything you want, you're free. But then when you actually try to do it, you discover, on the contrary, you're not free at all, and they would rather you didn't do it at all. That's a level of difficulty. But even beyond that, we then struggle with, what today's session is about. We're starting with, in End Times 3, in Introduction to the Issues, after most of the opening quotes, we're down to the last major quote from W.H. Auden, "We are lived by powers we pretend to understand." And this is kind of one of the core themes of Kenneth Smith's philosophy.
Don't you think that Kenneth Smith is actually doing a form that's sort of, how should I say, spread apart to imitate the form that you will in terms of experience, in a way, by giving you bits and juxtaposition to each other and rotating, you are forced to actually have to think about it and create the relationship between in yourself, rather than him like giving it to you in a neatly ordered file of lines like soldiers marching. I kind of think that's almost a style on purpose to, in a sense, imitate the notion of discovery.
That's right. Yeah. You know, this whole thing was inspired by Y2K, this whole series, Millennia and Microcosm. Yeah. And he's like, if we're going to make a big deal out of the millennium, maybe we should like stop in our tracks and think a little bit about, have there been other millennia? What happened during those times? And what is the significance of a millennium? This is kind of how he opens up the whole essay. And part of what he's trying to unpack for us is this idea that, I guess you could say Socrates' unexamined life is not worth living for a human being is sort of being one of the rallying cries of philosophy is being invoked here when he says the panic leading into Y2K was all very immersive and immediate and lacked any kind of self-consciousness of, well, what are we doing on a millennial scale? And what could we be doing? What should we be doing? So he's trying to sort of get us out of the initial layer of, can we stop just reacting and start thinking about the world and ourselves and who we are? And then he's trying to raise it up to a higher level of saying, the way that we live is not normal, right? This isn't, we take it for granted, but it isn't normal in any sense. It is a curious kind of parochialism that we mistake for universality. And we won't really appreciate that unless we can also look back at other periods and see how differently they lived from the way that we live. So that's what gets him into this project of let's compare and contrast three different epochs with each other, is to try to break out of the parochialism by creating alternative examples and learning how to navigate between them. But that's just, I think, as you raised, Phil, that's just a platform for being able to then move up to the next level of discussion, which is how do these periods, not just what are these periods in their own right, but how do these periods grow into one another? How do they transform? What is the process of change that can take place? Is it the great man theory? One person decides to lead everybody into the future, boldly going like endless heroic stories we've been, inculcated in, or do the forces of history automatically take care of all of our problems for us, and we should just sit back and enjoy it, as the enormous number of people that I know believe? Or is it far more complicated than that, and yet bound by natural laws, the way Hegel would argue, as from the bud to the blossom to the fruit, right? So there's this whole discussion about the transformation of epochs from one to another that we can't even have until we've worked out the levels below that, because those levels contain so many presuppositions and assumptions that inform the way that we even define the terms that we're trying to talk with, or the concepts we're trying to think with, that we can't even have the upper discussion until we've had the discussions underneath.
Well, my thought is that to break up the parochialism, it requires a degree of deconstruction.
Yes.
In other words, blowing it apart so you create enough gaps to see in between it. That's why that was my comment about the form itself. I mean, that's why you end up liking Nietzsche, because like he has these aphorisms that they're kind of like disconnected, right? And you have to sort between them. The Tao Te Ching, as a matter of fact, is aphorisms, right? Rather than a narrative that's already put together, which forms a kind of parochialism, and I think once again that allows the gap for you to into the gap and make sense of the gap, and add the gap into itself, and that's a process of construction your own mind has to make, rather than giving you the already that's in line, and so you remain in the shell of parochialism.
Kafka, right? I mean, this is part of why Kenneth Smith pulls out of multiple sources. A book should be an ice axe to break up the frozen sea within you. Like, the biggest problem to escaping parochialism is that we think we're not. We think we have a universal objective view of history, and that it is our birthright, that we are born this way as moderns. We can just see things better than anybody ever did. And what it does is it builds into us a blindness, an unwillingness to look that we don't even realize is operating. This is why Kafka says what you're saying effectively, that the way to escape parochialism is you have to break up the culture envelope that seems to account for everything and seems to have a clean explanation for everything, that makes you feel like you're on top of everything, so that you can begin to see the enormous gaps in your own understanding that lets you see past the envelope into the much larger world of possibilities that only then do you realize you've never really thought about or explored. You trapped within the bubble that seemed to suggest it was the whole universe. So I'm glad you brought that up, because that's going to be a recurring theme throughout all of this. But I see a line of hands, so I'm going to dive into it. Let's do Stephen, then Donald, then Jed. Go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, I'm always sort of amazed at this sort of modernist parochialism, that to the point where I can imagine some moderns getting a time machine, go back to ancient Athens, and they come out with their time machine. They say, "You poor guys, you're suffering. You're not. You don't have our modern lifestyle. It's tragic. So we've created all these suicide pills, but all you guys, the kindest thing we can do to you is put you all to sleep. Right. It's tragic that you're not us."
Right. And while, we would never come out and say those words, we would assume those things all the time in an unexamined way, and then not realize we were doing it. But it comes out in our language every time we talk about the savage, the primitive, the superstitious, the backwards, and equate those with the old, right? We're always, in every turn of speech, moderns can hardly resist patting themselves on the head and insulting the last 200,000 years of history. Everybody before us was a backward, stupid, primitive version of us, is an assumption.
The whole thing is their existence, beyond the fact of producing us, was worthless.
Exactly.
Their experience of existence.
That's why they were there. It's for us, because we're so marvelous, right?
Yeah, purely they were just the product to produce us.
So now they're redundant. We don't need them. There's us. Hooray.
So if we have a power, we can wipe history away. We can expunge it from existence.
Yeah, and that's what Orwell says.
Literally, the physical history that has to be expunged from existence, because the idea of the mental suffering of not being us is so tragic.
That's right. Those poor suckers. Yeah, and to tie you to Phil here for a moment, that is where Kafka is so marvelous, is that he is more willing to be sarcastic than just about any philosopher I've ever read. And he does it in ways that are so confrontational, you can't pretend he's not saying it. And he'll be sarcastic about things that you've taken for granted. And it's a really uncomfortable experience when you come across one of those Nietzsche snippets and you're stopped in your tracks going, well, I was with you right up until this sentence, but now you're making me feel uncomfortable. You seem to be implying that what I think of as wonderful is actually stupid and backwards. I don't understand. How can you be mocking glorious, marvelous I, a modern? What could be better? So again, Kafka, right? Breaking up the assumptions, trying to get the hard crust off the ground to be able to get to the fertile soil where we can start to grow new ideas. Donald, then Jed. Go ahead, Donald.
Well, in reading Kenneth, there's no argument to be remembered and then recited back. We're not doing math proofs here,
Right.
or something like that. And you know, the philosophical have to work through this material and come to their own knowledge.
Yes.
Kenneth's knowledge isn't going to help them.
Right.
What he has learned benefits him.
Right.
And if he can help others by writing these things, which is, I think, something he actually views as it's kind of a burden. And
Yes.
you know, and he does it on his own terms. You know, moderns need not apply. But yeah, and even if you knew all of this stuff verbatim, could recite it, you know, you had whatever, and you got into a conversation with Kenneth and you started feeding him his own stuff, he would rip you a new one.
Right. Right.
You know, I mean, this goes back. There are a few cases in the Socratic dialogues of Plato where people who have heard Socrates best somebody in an argument come up to him and try and give him his own argument, and he rips them up, showing they have not understood the argument.
Right.
They don't have the knowledge behind the argument. They haven't, in a sense, seen the reality. And so I just think these are great exercises, as you say, they're ice picks, you know, to break up our thought and get us thinking. Some of us may become philosophical or philosophers and be able to come to the kind of self-knowledge that we would need to be in that position. Other people might be like we talked, what is it, like 2 weeks? We might just be resurrecting the idea of an authority. Well, when we get to some of these issues, we now can really recognize that it's not just everybody's opinion, but there are some people that we can go listen to or get guidance from. And we have to find out where we are on that continuum. So the idea, it just seems like if we hurry up and read all of Kenneth, it's not like a mystery story. At the end, all is revealed. At the end, you're just as fucked over as you were when you started.
I object.
Preferably worse. That he has done such a number on your head that what you thought was clear when you started is now gone.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
ill-suited to the modern world as a result.
It is. And so, Rick, what I was initially going to say is, as much as finding out what Kenneth says in these documents is you put some effort, and I tried to my extent. How do you read them?
Mm-hmm.
If they're going to become an ongoing source of enlightenment worth reading, you have to here are sources in the Greek. You know, you've got to go look at Nietzsche. You've got to know about who's the translator? Walter Kaufman.
Yes.
You know, you've Gilbert Murray, his student, E.R. Dodds,
Mm-hmm.
Greeks and the Irrational.
Mm-hmm.
You've got to go back and do this. And this is part of, I always thought of it like it's the glass bead game, Magister Ludi. You know, it's this great meta web that tries to tie all of human history together and show you the relationships. But we'll see. But I'm not sure as far as I'm concerned, we could go at any speed because the place you get to is the same.
You're in no hurry to make faster progress through these essays.
Well, I don't believe that. I believe that progress is a modern idea that Kenneth is trying to teach us to reject.
Yes.
Or the progress would be not in understanding Kenneth, in understanding yourself. That's, I mean, sure, but I think I've said enough. Let somebody.
Thanks for the pick me up.
What are you talking about, Joseph?
Being just as messed up at the end, or even worse.
Oh, yeah, but maybe you have a sort of naive confusion at the beginning and a very sophisticated philosophical confusion at the end.
There it is. We're raising the level of difficulty. Go ahead,
Can
Sharon.
I just respond to that very quickly?
Yeah, please.
It's not about hurrying, Donald. It's about, I learned from having a broad overview and then I drill down, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm extremely pragmatic. So yes, we're going very, very slowly. And I appreciate the speed. It allows me to digest more. I'm not just chewing now, I'm digesting. So, but when I go from 1 to 14, and I really want to get what the moderns think, I'm trying to put some basis down in my mind so I can fill in the further analysis. It's just a learning style. It's not a speed.
Sure.
Yeah.
And I'm perfectly happy to. I promised David years ago that I would help him get some of this text up on the web, or I've got the scans too. And I can help convert some of it to text, and he can convert it to the web format. So we'll work on getting more stuff up for you. I'm perfectly happy to get more of it available for folks. Jed and then Phil.
Yeah, hi, I'm new to the group, so
Welcome.
I sort of used to study philosophy in high school. I'm from Paris, France, so where they study philosophy in high school.
Wonderful.
But I wanted to confront the ideas of Kenneth with the ideas of Francis Fukuyama, and that the post-historical world that he was, I forget when he, like in the 80s or the
1989.
90s. Yeah, after the fall of communism.
Oh, right before the fall of communism.
Before, okay, yeah. I'm not a specialist, but he said that history was over, and now people are starting to kind of go back on. He actually stated that he was wrong a few years. I think a few years ago. So how does Kenneth Marshall relate to Fukuyama? Does anybody have an answer or thoughts about that?
Well, I mean, we could ask him. I don't know how much Fukuyama he's actually read himself, but all of the modern thinkers are caught up in large scale cultural movements. There's a lot of ferment going on, and so frequently when people say things, it's not just their own idea, but it's part of a larger schema of ideas. The tendency to see the modern epoch as post-history, as the end of history, goes way back. It's almost the definition of the modern era that over and over different modern thinkers keep arriving at the same conclusion, thinking that they got there on their own themselves and not understanding they're part of a zeitgeist, as Hegel would say, that it's part of the spirit of modernism to believe that we are different from all previous epochs. We're more objective, we're more scientific, we're more advanced, we know more, and now the old ways are over, and we're into a bold new enlightened era of the pursuit of knowledge and rational organization. And as a result of that being the zeitgeist, we keep arriving at the same conclusions even when we try to think independently, having grown up within the set of ideas.
As you're pointing out, they thought Christianity or the religious society would be the solution to the corruption of old Rome. Today, the modern thinkers, the Enlightenment, they believe that there's this magic spirit called the Enlightenment and rationality, which will overcome the corruption of the medieval epoch.
Yeah. Jed, do you have the access to the chat, the text chat on the side?
Yeah.
If you could type in the name of the philosopher that you're interested in, I'll talk to Kenneth and I'll ask him if he's read his work, and we can get back to him after Phil goes. I'll give you guys a little amusing update. I talked to Kenneth last Monday, and we laughed our heads off. I thought I was going to die, but I can catch you up on some of the stuff he said. Sooner or later. Oh, thank you for that. Sooner or later, I think we'll get him to attend these. So, sorry, Joseph, you were going to say? Oh, okay.
I reacted to what was in the chat.
Okay.
I've only received one question for Kenneth so far from Stephen. I'm kind of disappointed.
You'd like people to type in some questions for Kenneth in the chat?
Stephen sent it to me privately, but just send a question and he'll come and answer it for us. But nobody's done that except Stephen.
So can I
centrifugal question.
Right.
So can I speak again? That's why I wanted to read everything so I could ask intelligent questions, because I don't feel very grounded, because we're going very slowly. And so that's why this weekend I sat down and read ahead, and I was kind of disappointed when I saw the moderns, because this is where I live.
Yeah.
And a lot of the questions I have would have been based on that, David. So I haven't forgotten. I'm just trying to come up with an intelligent question. And because this is not my field of study, yes, you're going slowly and I am learning, but I can't be comparative or critical or even inquiring.
Okay.
That's exactly
Am I making sense?
That's exactly right. And that's why we should pick up the pace a little for exactly that reason. When he first suggested it, he said, he'll do it at the end of Millennia Microcosm. And at the rate we're going, that's going to be in about 2 years.
Oh, I didn't know he'd said that to you. Okay. Yeah. I can get him here sooner.
So I told him that. I said the idea of a last session is hypothetical at this point.
That's right. That's right.
We either wait then or we do it as quickly as possible. And,
Well, give me the material, I'll digest it, and then I'll have questions from what I understand.
Yeah. Okay. I'll help David get these scans translated into text. I like doing that. I find it a soothing, meditative work to do. And then he can put it up on the web. And then I'll lean on Kenneth some more. But when I talked to him on last Monday, it sounded like, he's, as soon as he solves one or two technical issues, he's game to join us. So, oh yes, well, there's Stephen talking again about the Hegel's critique of Kant. We say this just about every week, right? What did Hegel say of Kant? He said Kant was like the medieval thinker who didn't want to get in the water to swim until after he was already a champion swimmer. Once he'd mastered swimming, then he would get in the water. And Hegel says, well, we learn by doing. So there's we gotta be willing to ask the dumb questions. Kenneth has a real sense of humor. When you get him on the line, you'll find he's going to spend a lot of time laughing, and he's not laughing at you; he's laughing with you most of the time. So it's not as scary as I'm making it sound. Just because he's able to write like this and think like this doesn't mean that he's looking for opportunities to beat people up or anything. He's not. Phil, and then I'll do a little update on what we talked about. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, there's so many things for me to comment on. I'll make part of it brief. I mean, for Sharon, your style is different from my style, because
absolutely,
you want to look down, have a kind of map to guide you in your journey and ask questions. I myself, I don't know whether it's kind of a inner confidence. I don't think it's confidence. Inner trust that things are not going to go the way it's going to go anyway. So when I travel, I generally have a very, very sketchy plan, but I allow the things to open up so that I never make a plan. I'm going to go here, rest there, and whatever. It's like, because suddenly something opens up and I need to take a detour, at least for a while, before I continue. So that's perfectly fine with me, because I think the openness of the trip itself will provide more than actually the destiny that I've laid out to begin with. So that's one answer. The other one was I thought Donald was a little too harsh, because I think that deconstruction has to be complemented by reconstruction.
Yes.
So that you have a degree of stability, so you're not suddenly lost all the time. So in some sense, I think you also find a balance, in the sense that if you don't build on the deconstruction, then you become totally lost. And so that's to help Joseph out, that we don't have to be absolutely in a panic. Anxiety is enough, not a panic. And to Jed, I think Hegel was, well, there's two camps of Hegel. The conservative camp actually believes Hegel said that, history is very near the end. In fact, it is at the end, the rational mind. And in some sense, all a matter of like kind of tidying up, mopping up the details. Yes. Okay. Yes. And I think that contradicted what the progressive wing of Hegelians are, that in a sense, it is to continue the role. And, so for the conservatives, the Prussian state was already near perfection.
Right.
It was near the end of history until Fukuyama says, no, this is the end of history. And now what we know, with the war in Ukraine, we know that that wasn't the end. Right. Because the end of history means there would be no major conflicts, no major ideas of conflict. And we now know that there, in fact, is a major conflict. And so, which means we're now waiting for yet another the end of history, which we don't know when it's going to be. So in some sense, depends how you read Hegel, whether the ball still continue to roll, or whether it's like, we're pretty damn close, right? It's a matter of finding things out. So I kind of think that we're not close at all. This is my thought. But anyway, so that's to help in unrolling Hegel, although some would prefer not to be unrolled any further.
Yeah. Thanks, Phil. Yeah, I mean, you read Hegel, you're going to find contradictions, because we all have contradictions within us, even no matter how hard we work, no matter how smart we are, no matter how good we are as authors, we're gonna be writing. The better we express ourselves, the more we're going to capture our own internal contradictions on the page.
Well, the dialectic by its nature has a gap.
Right. I mean, you can't deal with the dialectic without being, contradiction is your meat and potatoes at that point. So you knew people were going to have trouble interpreting Hegel. That was inevitable. Yeah, I called Kenneth after last week's session, just because we had so much fun last week. I had a really good time, and on this call, and I wanted to chat with him about it, because I felt like he was missing out. I worried that he would see this as an obligation, and that he needed to, make it all get himself all perfectly right and have everything be perfect, so that, it was a good presentation. And I'm like, no, man, just come and hang out. It's hilarious. We spent a lot of time laughing and talking. And I called his cell number and didn't get anything. So I call his home number, and he answers by saying, "What the hell is it now?" At which point I started laughing, and he started laughing. I laughed for 60 seconds. I just couldn't talk, because he knew that I would know that he didn't mean it, but that I wouldn't be expecting it. It reminded me of Calvin and Hobbes back in the day. Bill Watterson, used to run these little series in the Calvin and Hobbes comic strip. And one of the ones he did for a while was Calvin being afraid to open the door when he comes home because Hobbes is somewhere on the other side waiting to pounce, because Hobbes likes him so much that Hobbes can't resist flying out the door and landing on him and knocking him across the yard. And so Calvin starts to get more and more nervous about coming home, until finally he sneaks in from the other side and slams the door, and Hobbes flings himself out into the yard to no avail. And I thought, this is what Kenneth has just done to me here. It's like, this is a big, enormous pounce. Just to give you a sense of his sense of humor. So, he always feels ambivalent about the material he's written, because he's always, as a philosopher, he's trying to work to be better, to learn better than he did before. And the result of that is, if you look back on your old work, it pains you greatly. You may recall, about a year ago, we had a little one-off seminar with, I can't remember if it was just a general purpose seminar, but it was about one of his essays about Kant. And we all read up on that essay and we prepped ourselves for the essay. And then the day arrives and he's got a new version of the first opening of the essay and he wants to present that instead. And it's because he can't resist. He reads his old essays and he's like, oh, this is terrible. Why would I say these things? None of this is as clear as it should be. And I really didn't explore this idea set here that should have been explored. And I'll just start over. Well, so, when you talk to him on the phone, what you're always going to get is that he's working on so many things at the same time. He's got so many essays and work and so many ideas for books. And, he's also doing some painting, and he's also still trying to move out of the house in Duncanville. They're still hauling out books and old bookcases and old pieces of art. And they go up there every week to move more stuff to the Austin place or into long-term storage. I think he's got so much long-term storage that they're renting that it's like a whole nother house full of material. So yeah, I think he would just have a good time if we came to these. But Sharon, I'm with you on the idea that, I could work with David. I could get him all the text so that we could get it all up on the web. People could read ahead as far as they want to, do the overview of the whole thing. And then, we could chew over the material in depth, having had access to the breadth at the same time, so that people can tackle it whichever way, suits their learning style.
But I'd like you to accommodate everybody's learning style, because
Exactly.
everybody has what I don't have, a philosophy foundation. So, and so this is where I get most of my information from. I read, I look up, I Google this, I Google that. And I really like these essays for a couple of reasons: the information and the relevancy, the relevancy to the time now. That's just amazing to me.
Yeah.
Right. And that's why I go ahead to hear what Kenneth has to say, particularly when he comes to the moderns, because I think what we take with us is our human nature.
That's right.
And that
So let's dive into
behavior.
it. So let's dive into it. Let's kind of work our way through the text a little more then. So the opening paragraph right after I'm not going to dig in deep into the W.H. Auden quote, other than to say, I think I mentioned this a week or two ago, that it's a very famous, much quoted line from a poem that he wrote as a eulogy for his friend. I posted the name of it up, in memory of Ernst Toller, up above. And I've read it a number of times all the way through. And it's mostly he's trying to wrestle with the problem of, how could someone who gave his whole life to trying to make things better for everybody else then abruptly commit suicide out of nowhere? And nobody saw it coming. I mean, they knew he wrestled with demons, but there's a difference between wrestling with demons and offing yourself. And, Auden really dug deep to try to, at that point, he'd been writing poetry for quite some time. He had a real command of language. He was very thoughtful about things. Kenneth Smith cites him often as an example of a poet who's more than skin deep, who really, tries to work through issues, like Yeats is another one. And, he tried to produce a poem that would be a worthy eulogy for this guy who had done so much for others, but then didn't take enough care of himself. And what does it mean when you're possessed by demons like that. And that's why he writes, that was the context in which he originally wrote, we are lived by powers we pretend to understand. Kenneth loves nutshell quotes like this. And it's frequently not, when he's done with it, it's not because he's trying to academically represent precisely what the original author meant in the way that he takes and uses these quotes. Instead, he uses them as logic bombs, as ice axes to help break up our assumptions, even if the way that he's using the quote isn't the way it was originally meant.
Mhm.
And in this case, it was. This is an example of a quote that, you know, Ouden would respect the way that Smith's using it, but there are others where the author would be upset with Kenneth Smith for the way that he's using the quote. But Kenneth doesn't care. That's not his point. His point is not to, is not to prove how precisely how precise his fidelity is to the original intentions of the author, and to demonstrate his academic chops by being able to not make any statements that aren't 100% justified by the text. None of that's what Kenneth's trying to do. What Kenneth's trying to do is living philosophy, where he's trying to get the reader to break up their own assumptions. And so, he grabs these nuggets and uses them. So he sets that quote up as the opening for the longest section of chapter 3 of uninterrupted text without any citation, without any quotes. And this is where he's bringing it around to the modern case. What he's talking about here is directed right at us. He's talking about the modern world. And this opening paragraph, not by any conscious or deliberate way of thinking, does a civilization imprint its order on its subjects, which right off the bat is a contradiction with how we think civilization works, right? We think you explicate your law, you write your constitution, you explicate your laws, everything is out in the open and conscious and rational. That's how we think culture building happens. That's how we've built our society. And here he is right off the bat saying, oh no, it doesn't work like that, right? He says, but by the taken for granted forms, active in their presuppositions, their ineffable myths and deepest beliefs. Right? So we've talked a lot about the way that the basal metabolic function of noesis, the intellect, the rationalizing, what Hegel called Verstand. We've talked a lot about the way that it is a formalizing, systematizing, egotistical schema of thinking, in which how things are is less important than what you want. And even when you try to describe how things are, when you do it noetically, you do it in a abstracted way, in which you extract from the whole fabric of what something is the parts that you have decided are important. And you construct a schema of logic and rules and laws and mathematics out of those abstracted parts instead of out of the thing itself, most of which you left behind when you abstracted from it. You see this in medicine all the time. This is basically how medicine works, is we've got the whole organism, but we're going to measure your blood pressure. We'll measure your blood sugar. We'll make a list of vital statistics. And then we'll make our theories of treatment based on those abstractions from the whole. And that provides the framework. Now, medicine tries to compensate for that by training people also to immerse themselves in the patient and understand and look at the patient and be involved with the patient. All of that because there is a history of bad medicine in which we didn't do that, in which we just tried to stamp out solutions mechanically. And in medicine, we prove that that doesn't work. Part of what's interesting to me about medicine is it's a field in which we tried the noetic experiment and failed, and found ourselves having to find ways to pull gnosis back into it and get the doctor and the nurse and the other care practitioners to be more involved and to get the family history and to pay attention to the whole of the patient and to marry that to the abstract schema of the vital statistics and what they say about theory. So, but what he's talking about in this paragraph, in this opening sentences, is he's hitting us directly in the core beliefs of moderns. We, despite medicine having had to reach back to this gnosic fabric of the whole, our laws and governments and economy still resist doing that. We don't want to follow that example. We want to be the pure more intellectual, more systematic, more analytical thing. You know, the law is the law for everyone, regardless of their circumstances. That's what we want. A dollar is a dollar, and the way that it works is the same everywhere in the world. We don't want it to be different, you know, in different places and to mean different amounts to different. We don't want any of that. We want rigorous, systematic, universal, abstract. We want a noetic paradise of crystalline perfection. And that leads us to think that it is what we consciously choose that creates our culture. But here he is right off the bat, inverting it in the most unsympathetic way and saying, when we did the noetic operation of selecting, of abstracting out the parts we thought were important, we didn't just make a few mistakes. We literally left behind as the background all of the things that are responsible for creating a culture. It's why modernity, despite the fact that we throw the word culture around as though we have one, doesn't have a culture. We have an anti-culture, right? We govern according to our abstractions instead of according to the whole. We pride ourselves on disregarding all the stuff we've shoved back into the background, which is the very soil and material of living organic culture. So this is why he says in the rest of this paragraph, virtually all of us think about our format of society with the resources it, i.e. that society, inculcated in us. We evaluate it, if at all, by its own preconceptions, right? So any opinions we have about it, we think are our opinions, but they're actually modernity's own opinions about itself, because we're thinking with modernity's tools instead of with any authentic organs of thinking. We're captured before we begin thinking philosophically, so that when we first try to think reflectively about things, it's already too late. All our definitions are wrong, all our concepts are wrong, all our assumptions are wrong, and our native habits of thinking are all wrong. So this is why we need the ice axe, right? To break up these tracks. Sorry, Joseph. All right, let me call on hands. We'll do Stephen, then Phil, then Joseph. Go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, that's my observation when I'm looking at that paragraph. That just seems to have become my observation in recent times.
Yes.
That what creates history? And I just can't see it really being a product of the conscious mind.
No.
Invariably, the conscious mind is what will get in the car seat and drive the car off a cliff somewhere. Civilization, history, mankind, or whatever it is, has been going on despite the rationalisms, which consciously, I think all rationalisms lead to a certain sort of death, a stasis, as you were pointing out.
Yeah.
Now, it's like this with the word colonisation. This has become the new bug word of the left. But to me, it's as clear as the light of day that not just humans, but almost every organism is a coloniser. Every person I see is trying to propagate themselves, if not physically, then by ideology. They literally want to invade the minds of others and put their perfect perspective in the other minds, take away the blinkers of the other mind and enlighten them with the propagating their particular mental attitude. So to me, it's curious when you see this ship of history, the SS Propagation, sailing across the ocean full of ideologues who talk about the evil of colonisation. To me, that's just tragic. This is the thing. We are being carried along by unconscious forces, while at the same time stating that they are evil. Please.
You know, that last point you made, it really goes to the heart of modernity, right? That modernity wants to scapegoat the feelings and the experiences and the memories as being the source of evil, while lifting up reason and rationality as the source of goodness. And yet, you know, if what Kenneth is saying here is right, the thing that's being castigated as the source of evil is actually the source of culture. and vitality, and the thing that's being held up as the angel of reason that we should all aspire to, the perfect Vulcan world that we want to build, is impossible for us, and was actually, the recipe behind the Holocaust and all kinds of other great terrible things that have happened. It's people over planning, overthinking, over abstracting, and not dealing directly enough with the way things actually are. Phil, and then I don't forget that Joseph had his hand up, so I'll come back to you. Phil first.
Yeah, I see this as what I call the ontological difference, right, between the ideal and a manifestation. There's the gap, and the gap is most dangerous when it's manifested in the ideal itself. For instance, like our Constitution says, we hold these truths to be self-evident. Actually, that's the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights. Well, actually, the contradiction shows itself, and is most dangerous when it shows itself within itself, because people are likely to believe what you say, right? I mean, if you didn't say all men are created equal, like there are people who deserve to be at the bottom, people deserve to be in the top, then maybe there would be less of an argument. But when you actually say it, that's kind of a promise that you're not keeping, and your own contradictions. But I'll go I think a level deeper. I think that's a problem, is that there might not be a way to resolve the ontological difference, because I think there might be a continual gap between the relationship of ideas and its manifestation. And I was struck by his example of the Klein bottle.
Yes.
The Klein bottle is conceptually possible in 3 dimensions, but we live in a 3-dimensional world. You would say, well, then why can't it manifest itself? Well, then I thought about the Mobius strip. The Mobius strip actually does manifest itself. Suppose a 2-dimensional surface with a front and a back, when you twist it, it becomes a one-sided strip. so that one dimension could be twisted into a 2-dimension could be twisted into 1 dimension and a 3-dimensional relationship.
Yes.
We exist in a 3-dimensional space, at least centrally speaking.
Yes.
Right? You can say, well, we have a 4th dimension, no, but that's a dimension of time. It's not a dimension of space. If we actually exist in a 4th-dimensional space, maybe the Klein bottle would exist. There's a gap between the level of the ideas and the level of the manifest reality. And so in some sense, so I think maybe modernity had recognized that there's going to be this gap between the ideas and the manifestation. And it solved it, and I'll go back to the spectacle, and they have to control the spectacle. I was impressed by this guy. I find his name, but he used to teach at Duke. They fired him because the students loved him so much, and the parents got rather riled up, and they fired him. Well, which is, I guess, kind of like Kenneth Smith. And so, in some sense, he says, in the late 19th century, Freud made an important, postulate about the id, the underlying subconscious that rises to the top to inform the ego, right?
Yeah.
And he says, no, this is no longer possible because the society provides the id. The id is now conscious and is fulfilled by the spectacle. And you go to the market, you have choice. You clearly have choice. There are green beans of one brand, green beans of another brand, and green beans of another brand, and that's your choice. The choice is limited, but you are actually free to choose. That's the spectacle that fulfills the id. And now you have choice. And so in some sense, the conscious is now left, the subconscious or the unconscious is left like absent, nowhere. Because the modern society has fulfilled the ideas and the id through the market. So that you have this false image that we presume it to be false, but actually it seems very real. And that's the ecosystem that you live in, not the ecosystem of nature. So therefore, if you live in that thing and you don't think about it, you are totally fulfilled, but you are, of course, alienated from yourself. So that's the interesting thing. And that we now have both the conscious mind and the unconscious mind existing in the world of consciousness.
Yeah, it's certainly, I think one of the arguments that Kenneth Smith makes tangentially but repeatedly is that part of where the classical Greeks went wrong in their attempts to describe human character types is that they didn't fully appreciate that the Banausoi were a separate class, that they were a separate character type. That the traits of Banausoi, the Greeks thought were on the one hand either somehow part of the douloi, the slaves, and on the other hand part of themselves, the aristoi. They didn't see that there was a third separate character type at work in the marketplaces and in the crafts halls and so forth. And it's part of why they fell apart, is because their understanding of what was a virtue and what was a vice was a little, they could grasp the things going on and see the problems with them, and yet not fully understand where it was coming from or what, and therefore as a result what to do about it. Understanding the actual anatomy of the situation you're in is liberating, because it creates the possibility of doing something about it. As long as you're confused about the circumstances you're in, you're kind of a helpless pawn, because you're trapped in that state where your attempts to act are based partly on a fantasy. And so, you go charge it where you think the dragon is and nothing happens. The fire keeps burning because it wasn't from a dragon, and, you haven't solved your problem. And that's kind of what was happening with the classical Greeks during the Peloponnesian War and the collapse. So, but part of the bounty of the medieval epoch is that when it reached its peak of corruption towards the end, there was no disputing anymore who the Banausoi were. Everybody could see the maximal corruption of the church that was taking place, the difference between the faithfulness of the rank and file and the absolute corruption of the people who were running the power structures above them. It was just on display nakedly for the whole world to see. And that was one of the blessings of the medieval epoch, is that for the first time it made it impossible to forget that there is a tendency among human beings, a strange attractor or gravity well that we can fall into to become that kind of Banausic type. So in the modern epoch, of course, we've sort of set them all loose. And in this sense, if you line it up with Freud, the douloi here are supposed to be representing the id. And, Kenneth Smith argues that modernity is a regime under which people are allowed to be either douloi or Banausoi, but absolutely no aristoi. And all aristoi have to be crushed down into one of the other two forms and deform themselves. And so as a result, you get to see the id on parade, because the whole marketplace is designed to, cater to them and draw out their money and get them to work for it. And you can't see the Banausoi quite as clearly, because they're always trying to pretend we're all equal. Part of the reason they want to say all men are created equal is to say, we are totally not the wolves who are fleecing you. We're totally not the con men who are smarter and better educated than you and know the system better than you and are going to relieve you of all your money. We're totally not those people. We're just like you. Trust us. Would we lie to you? But on the other hand, they also can't resist the things that they do, right? The impulses of banal soy. And so you get these big SNL crises, for example, that just sort of lay naked to the whole world that some termites have been working on the foundations. And by extension, we can sort of infer what kind of personality type would do that. And, you know, obviously they have a great deal of power to be able to make an impact on the world on such a scale. So, you know, part of the point of this, there is a stage in the development of our philosophical understanding when it comes to sociology and culture and psychology that is extremely depressing, because up until then, we were raised with a whole bunch of beautiful illusions about the circumstances that we were in. And those illusions, even though they ultimately lead to misery, it's not clear how they lead to misery. They promise happiness. And as long as we don't think about the bad things, at the moment when the bad thing isn't happening, it can feel really nice. To have to turn and look at the dumpster fire that's going on is you know, initially depressing, because you're being disillusioned of all that. But the good news about it, the way that it ultimately leads to happiness, is once you understand that there's a dumpster fire, you can get a fire extinguisher and put it out. If you don't know that that's what's wrong, you're just going to keep getting burned and not know why. There is this way in which certain kind of, I speak as a bipolar person here, bipolar shift between happiness and unhappiness that happens when you don't know how the world works. You don't see the problem coming, so you're happy until it hits you, and then you're unhappy, but you don't know why you're unhappy. But then after it's over, you can go back to being happy again. There's this kind of binary flip-flopping that happens. And it creates great moments of happiness at the price of also cultivating great catastrophes that cause great unhappiness that you didn't see coming because you didn't know how the world worked. So the point at which you realize you have a dumpster fire is a point at which you can start to take some control over the world and start to head off some of those crises and catastrophes. And so on the one hand, it means that you don't get the pure unalloyed happiness of everything's fine when actually now you know it's not. But it does allow you to avoid the catastrophic, all of my happiness has come falling down around me and I don't know why, and I don't know what to do about it. That is the price of the Dulic lifestyle that we're encouraged to inhabit. So this is what I mean. There's the philosophical education isn't just about, you know, leaving a state of happiness for a state of increasing unhappiness and despair as you learn more. You also get to be less catastrophized, and there's a certain amount of pleasure that comes from reducing the catastrophes in our life and from knowing what the hell's going on. But we'll dig into this some more later. Sharon, you got your hand up. And your mute on.
I said, I think Joseph wanted to say something. You changed your mind, Joseph?
Yeah, I changed my mind. It had to do with when Rick was talking about the health example, but it's okay. It's not, you can go ahead. You go first.
Well, having brought it up, I want to say, Rick, you're absolutely right on that, because within the last 5 or 6 years, one of the terminologies that's come into medicine is called the social determinants of healthcare.
Yes.
And what that means, and we saw it in the pandemic, the patients whose social determinants of healthcare were the poorest and the highest frequency of death, right? And by that, where you lived, how arduous your job was, and those are the people at the bottom of the socioeconomic scale. They had no say in what they did. And so that's a new terminology. Now, what I really wanted to say is I wanted to comment on something that Phil said, the gap between ideology and manifestation. That gap, I think, is called living, right? And that's where all the different character types come in, the Banusoi, the Aristoi, the Noedic, right? And that's how we get to figure it out. Because the American Declaration of Independence, we hold this truth to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, is an illusion. It's imagination. Because after you see a number of births, none of us are born equal. Some people are born with one eye, 9 fingers.
Right.
So not even the great one makes us all equal.
Right.
And so, and the third point that I wanted to say to kind of emphasize or to support the point you were making, and this comes from my reading ahead, so forgive me. It said the Greeks came to invent philosophy and science because of their heightened sense of that universally human liability to believe what one already wants to believe. And that is to say, the delusional potentiality of thought and culture.
Right.
And that's the process of living. And that's the figuring out that you're talking about. How do we sort out all those delusions so we're not bipolar, so we're not manic, so we're not depressed? That's what it is. And some people, everybody goes through those phases, some at more extremes than others.
Yes. Yeah, those are all good points. It's hard to, I'm going to use medicine again as another example, based on what you said. There is one of Kenneth Smith's critiques of Socrates is that Socrates was an ultra rationalist who had more in common with the sophists he criticized than he realized. He didn't fully appreciate everything that he was doing when he was doing it. When he says that an unexamined life is not worth living for a human being, there are ways in which that's the rallying cry of philosophy and has been ever since. But there's also ways in which it's a profound fallacy. In fact, it's both at the same time. Because in medicine, the stage at which you rationally think about every last move you make and decision you make is called med school. And people who come out of med school, initially, they're not as good as the people who've been doing it for decades. One of the differences between the two is that the people who've been doing it for decades have experienced medicine so much that they don't have to think about every move they make. They create a separation between the background and foreground, where they have an enormous number of habits, generally healthy, useful habits, that they don't have to think their way through with great concentration. They may still use checklists, they may still be diligent and careful, but it's not like a new idea to them every time they do it, the way it is for a med student who's first encountering the idea of how you're supposed to do a certain kind of suture, or how you're supposed to do, some other procedure. It is the pushing down into unconscious habits of what we have learned that makes mastery possible, right? The kid who keeps falling over when he's trying to learn the bicycle is trying to think his way through riding a bicycle. The kid, let's say the Olympic bicyclist who wins the gold medal thinks about almost none of those things when they're bicycling. Almost all of that has been made unconscious and automatic through muscle memory and long experience, so that it frees up their mind to think about a different level of problem. Mm-hmm. And it's the same in medicine. The people who, an anesthesiologist who's been an anesthesiologist for decades, because she doesn't have to think about each and every move of what is this anesthesia, what is that anesthesia, what is this person's, everything isn't brand new to her. So as a result, she has a baseline of decades of habits that free up her mind to watch for anomalies and watch for strategically important situations, and also watch the rest of the room and see if there's people around who aren't, noticing things, or is there information that needs to be called to someone's attention. She can think strategically because she's not trapped thinking about each and everything that she does. Socrates' ideal of a 100% conscious mind is actually unattainable for a human being. It leads to incompetence. Noesis is simply too linear and too point-oriented to keep up with the rich fabric of relationships that we're immersed in, that's constantly shifting around us, even if we don't take an action. And as soon as we take actions, we're changing it, right? Gnosis is the mental faculty that's perfect at immersion and forming wholes and noticing patterns. That's what it's good at. And someone who has the kind of experience in anesthesiology that Sharon does is using gnosis for an enormous amount of what she does, so that her noesis can be freed up to be for the things that it's genuinely useful for noticing the anomalies, for noticing what doesn't fit the pattern, for thinking strategically, right? It's a good relationship between the two, but it's a kind of thing that the Greek ultra-rationalists didn't understand about the human mind and how it worked. They had no idea. So if we could become fully conscious, we'd become fully incompetent. I like to think about, eating an apple. Eating an apple is we focus on the parts of it that we're aware of, that we look at and that we manipulate with our hand. But if that was all there was to eating an apple, we would starve to death. Almost all the important parts of eating an apple happen after that, when it gets broken down, and then millions of archaea and bacteria work on the broken down material of the apple to convert it into food for us. We have no conscious or even unconscious involvement in any of that. And that's the most important part of eating an apple. In fact, it isn't even us in the literal monadic sense of self versus other, right? It's this whole community living inside of us that without a single nerve cell to be found anywhere in it, knows what to do with apple pulp to convert it into energy. Without that vast unconscious activity, we would die, literally die. It's not just about being competent at things. It's even our basic survival is predicated upon this vast unconscious metabolism, right? This ecosystem. And medicine's learned how to harness that, and how to take med students who've been to classes and learned book theory and immerse them into the experience of a hospital, so that they can begin to build up that gnosis to correspond to the noesis. It's nice to know the theory of medicine, but to actually stand in there and have to deal with a patient who's different from anything that was in the textbook is hugely educational, in a necessary way that they can't get in a class. That's why medicine has worked in that component, that rich component of medical education, in an attempt to overcome the limitations of noesis. So what does that mean for us in the modern world as moderns? So the tendency as moderns, if we come at philosophy, is to think that we're going to learn how to think our way through problems. And that's because modernity is very intellect obsessed, very noesis obsessed. We since declaring things and passing laws and creating systems is how we organize ourselves, as far as we know, we assume that thinking through good designs is how we will make a better world. But of course, the thing that we are least competent to understand as moderns is the role played by the non-thinking part of our lives, the experiential part of our lives, the doing, not the thinking. I got mason bees. I'm going to take a left turn here. I got mason bees. In fact, I'm going to take this outside. I'm going to show you. This is something that's really important to me for very emotional reasons. And there's a lot of philosophy to be gathered out of this. So I'm going into my backyard. This is my backyard. It's drizzling just a little bit right now here in Seattle. And right here on the wall, right, this is our little mason bee house. It's very small. It's not that big. And all but one of them are asleep right now in their little cocoons. They spend most of their lives asleep. And, they are special because they're solitary. They don't have a hive. They don't have honey. They don't have a queen. They don't have a hierarchy to defend. They don't have, a whole bunch of resources to protect. And so they don't sting much. They mostly spend all their time when they're awake out, gathering pollen and nectar and laying eggs for the next season. They're only up for about 6 weeks, and then that's it. They die. And the new ones are born in the darkness inside these tiny little tubes that their mothers have made for them. And they're born on top of a ball of pollen and nectar. and they eat it and they grow up in the dark. And when they're full-sized, they weave a cocoon around themselves and go to sleep for 10 months until the next spring when it gets warm. So I've never raised bees before. I've never done anything like this. But now that they're here, I'm weirdly obsessed with them. I worry about them. I mean, I look at my yard and I'm like, are there enough flowers for them? Is there enough pollen? Is there enough nectar? I've been living in this house for 22 years, but I never bought a new plant for it until I got mason bees and began fretting about them and worrying about how do I make them happy? And I realized that I'm not going to be able to solve this problem by thinking, right? I have to solve this problem by getting out in my garden and doing things. If I don't do those things, they're going to starve, right? There isn't a system of thinking that's going to fix this problem. So over here, I don't know how far my internet's going to reach, but I guess we're going to find out. Right here is the first plant I've bought in 22 years. Red flowering currant. Look at all those flowers. Most of the stuff in the yard is asleep, but this sucker right here, it's going. And I bought that for them because I'm so excited by the prospect that my little mason bees won't be hungry and I can take care of them. And I'd been feeling depressed off and on this year for a variety of reasons. But when I got these little mason bees and I started worrying about them, and it motivated me to go get a little plant that had flowers and put it out there for them. And now I know they won't be hungry. I can't begin to tell you how happy it made me. I mean, I have this surge of joy around the fact that I'm taking care of these little critters through my actions. So, you know, I could have responded to, you know, feeling down by reading more inspirational works or thinking great thoughts and writing little essays and so on. And I could have even gone out and got antidepressants. I don't think any of it would have done half as much good as just putting down my books and going out into my garden and getting a little plant that has flowers so that I can sleep easy at night, knowing that my tiny little black bees are not going to go hungry. I'm talking about this because there is this relationship between the reflex to believe that noesis is promised, that it will solve all our problems if we just do it more, if we just rationalize more and think more and plan more. It's almost irresistible for a modern in a way it never was for any previous epoch, because nobody ever tried to purify themselves as kind of pseudo-Vulcans before the way we have. But it is that unconscious part of our lives, the acting, the doing, the remembering, the feeling. Gnosis is a different kind of way of experiencing the world. And the thing that it's especially good at, that noesis is especially bad at, is giving us a sense of connection and meaning that we can't find anywhere in the labyrinths of noesis. It's just not on offer there.
So may I share a story?
Please.
So I met this in the clinic I volunteer. You know, it's a state clinic for the uninsured, the undocumented, everybody. So what that means is that medical students and people who come to this country and don't have a medical license get to volunteer there.
Yes.
So I've been working with a guy who was a Syrian refugee, came to America about 7 years ago. 5, 6 years ago. He spoke Arabic, learned English, did all the qualifying exams, and then he came to work with me 2 years ago, and he finally matched. He got a place, and for people who don't understand that, as a foreign medical graduate, you have to go, you have to compete with all the American graduates to get a place in the residency.
Yes.
And his scores were so high on all the qualifying exams that he matched this year. And so I can relate to you. It was just such a sense of satisfaction for me, because the first time I met him 2 years ago, he didn't quite know how to approach an American patient. Right. He was very different very different. And so when he presented to me, I said, we got to answer a couple of questions. Why are they here today? And what are you going to do about it? So it's the same kind of satisfaction that I got on the first Friday in March when the match came out, and he called me at 1 o'clock in the morning and said, Dr. Townsend, I matched. Thank you very much. All of a sudden, it was like me starting all over again.
Yes.
So in life, they say you need to have something to love, something to do, and something to be satisfied about. That last category, I think, is the most important one. And I think the Greeks understood that too.
They were better at that than we are.
So thank you for the interruption, Phil.
Phil, then Stephen, then Joseph. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I want to start passing thanking you, Rick, for bringing up something big. But I'll first address what Sharon said in the previous thing, and then come back to you. Like what Sharon said about, I think it has something to do with, knowing your class structure or the difference. Is this guy that I talked about, Rick Roderick, who got fired at Duke? He says, we presume that there's a class society because you could rise through the top. And, when we give stories like racial algebra,
Yes.
look how he succeeded and so forth.
Yes.
And so there are these examples. But he said for the ordinary guy, the way you test that is stop working for years, for let's say 8 years, he said. You will soon find yourself living under a bridge.
Yep.
And that's why you know that you're working class, because you need to work. And so he has an easy definition for working class. That's what it is. You need, if you were very, very rich and were very well supplied, you're probably still okay.
Yeah.
You're not working class, right?
Yeah.
And so that was important. He just make these arguments sort of so simple in terms of testing what the system was. He was actually talking about Marx, not Leninism or Stalinism, but Marx. He said that never been tested, but nonetheless, he says, that's how you know that there is a working class, and what Marx says in that aspect was true. Okay. But getting back to what you said, it got me to start thinking like, oh, okay, like there's the conscious mind and there's this unconscious. And I might add a class what we call the subconscious, that's just below the surface. There's the unconscious, which I would call Jung's collective unconscious, which is deeper. It's built into something through history and through experience of many, many generations. But now you introduce something that's kind of, I believe, a deep subconscious. And that has to do with, and it came to me when you say, well, when you eat an apple, there are all these bacteria and things that and it's even beyond your collective unconscious, right? That is connected to the world itself, right?
Yeah.
And that in a funny way is a part of you. I shouldn't say in a funny way. In a deep way, it is a part of you.
Yeah.
Because your actual existence depends on this whole connection between the deep unconscious, the collective unconscious, the subconscious, and the conscious, right? And I think that's so important because it really gets back to at least our beginning to understand the ecological system. It's actually a part of who we are, right? And I would go back to, let's say, what Merleau-Ponty says. The world, the importance about the world is not the thing, or even a collection of things, as if you could collect all these things and line them up in a museum and you got it. He says, it's understanding the dimensions of experience. Now, I'll go a bit further. I would call it understanding there is a dimension of existence, right? Because once you understand that dimension, then you begin to understand the whole of what it is to exist in the world. And that is the thing that works in relationship to the consciousness. Now, I will defend Kant to a certain degree. Kant does say there's the noumena that we can never understand. He left it aside, okay?
Yeah.
And I think he might have been wise to leave it aside because it's just too impenetrable, it's transcendental, right? So in that sense, he is dealing only with the rational mind, but he is not ignoring this other part. He just say, I'll leave that for later on for somebody to, and I think he left that open so that, in a sense, Hegel could come in and say, it is the spirit. So I think we'll begin and unravel that. Now, the spirit only takes you so far because now we're going to talk about the collective unconscious is part of the spirit. And now you could say, really, in some ways, the deep unconscious, it's also maybe part of spirit, or at least something that relates to this dimension of existence. And I think I want to thank you for pointing that out. The part that we always consider, that really is not a part of us at all. I mean, that is the outside of us, the other, those nasty germs.
If only we could kill them all.
Right. And it's like, no, you might have to be selective in killing some of them, but it's like it is actually part of who we are. In fact, I think biologists would tell you there are maybe more of you or consist of that part than what you think is really a part of yourself. So that's very, very interesting. Thank you for that insight.
Thanks, Phil. Stephen and then Joseph. Go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, I just came across this Nietzsche quote.
Yeah.
Now, I assume when he says the word socialism, he's not only talking about the Marxist variety, but any type of socialism. For example, it took me a long time to pick up on what people are saying, that the fascists were textbook socialists. And there are many varieties of socialism. Christianity was one of the great social things. Islam is socialist. But these religious ones were successful. Christianity, trial by error, 1,000 or more years of working out a social technique. Islam's the same. They were successful. And now we're experimenting with new socialist ideas. And did Nietzsche have a very clear insight into what was going to occur when they attempted to apply these various types of socialism to the world post Nietzsche's death? And so Nietzsche, I heard he was regarded as a prophet, and this was his prophecy. So I was wondering what you thought on the will. What's hidden in socialism is the will to negate life. It would result in a tremendous expenditure of human lives if they try this experiment.
Yeah, this is classic Hegelian critique, right? Because Hegel argues that implicit in noesis, implicit in intellect and planning, is a negation of life. You know, the living matrix that gnosis is so close to, that it immerses us in, the ickiness of pathos, of suffering existence. That's what noesis climbs out of and tries to stand up on a pedestal to get its feet clean. You know, Hegel identifies that act of self-extraction to be capable of doing this intellectual planning as a negation of life. And Nietzsche here is trying to make it more explicit. It's inherent. This is what's hard for us, is that it's inherent to the way each and every one of us thinks about the world, that we have this life-affirming, immersive, whole-forming faculty, gnosis, at work. And we have this life-rejecting, purifying, abstracting, self-systematizing faculty at work, noesis. And they're both there at the same time. And, you know, depending on our personality type, we're letting one or the other be dominant and making the other one try to serve the one that we prefer.
Well, Adolf Hitler's vision of the future, the 1,000-year Reich, where everybody would run around purely operating to satisfy some external idea of what's good and proper,
Was
which is
prescriptivist, right?
completely at odds
Yeah,
with the cultures which existed previously.
exactly. It was a great negation. Yeah. And likewise, the way that he wanted to recreate the US frontier experience by having Germany treat the Slavs as though they were Indians and expand into Eastern Europe as though it were wilderness and take it from them and subjugate them. That was his great dream, you know, inspired by Karl May's romantic Western novels. You know, that is an act of negation in the same way. He's trying to erase the complexities of the world he's living in and replace it with the fantasy world that appeals to his intellectual schema, so that, you know, he can then carry out the schema and feel like he's not doing anything wrong. It might even be virtuous from his noetic perspective.
Well, he obviously he believed that Germans were a superior level of culture, which would be a better use of that vast territory than the silly Slavs.
Right. Right. He saw himself as a cowboy. Right? That was what he wanted to be when he was growing up reading. And that was why he made these soldiers and upper officers all read those Karl May novels. Let's all be cowboys and let's go conquer the, in his case, not the West, but the East.
The only thing is most of the fascists, when they were looking for an ideology that suit them, saw themselves as being Hegelians. But Hitler went Schopenhauer, this belief in the will towards life.
Yes.
For example, his derogatory statement about Christianity is even worse than anything the Marxists ever said, that Christianity is a mental illness.
That's Schopenhauer.
It's not the way you go.
Right, right. Yeah. Nietzsche had some biting things to say about Schopenhauer too after a while. Joseph, you got your hand up, go ahead, and then we'll go back to the text.
I was just going to thank you actually for using that, taking us outside and actually showing that B example, because I think it's actually profound on a number of levels. So in a sense that if you kind of rationalize what's going to make you feel better, and how it's going to, and that you can't get there by rationalization. Yeah. So, you know, there's somebody that I know that was, takes a utilitarian approach, and I agree with a lot of things they say in general, but in this particular instance, he was, you know, calculating the value of what it would cost for a seeing eye dog and saying, well, no, you should put your money into research to stop blindness as opposed to a seeing eye dog. And it was like this kind of like calculation, literally. Yes. That was saying this is the way it's going to make you feel better. You'll feel this is a more efficient way and more logical, rational way to do it. Yes. Totally discounting the fact of all the other things that actually the dog brings to the person in general. It's not just to see. It also helps the dog actually it makes the person feel better themselves. Yeah. But this is when we all, you know, start to genuflect at the altar of you know, numbers and kind of just how to only use one way of thinking and kind of just strictly I'm trying to think of it, how to say it properly, but I think you get the point, because I think that there's so much more into as far as human intuition that goes into these types of things, that actually it was a really important point that you just made. You know, it's something that it's much deeper than just trying to rationalize our way out of a problem. You can't necessarily do it. it
Yeah.
doesn't always work that way. And that was a
Yeah.
very good example as to how to look at it. Anyway,
Thank you, Joseph.
thank you.
My inclination was to apologize for the intrusion about going out and
Oh,
showing
we
my
liked it. We liked it.
Yeah.
No, I thought it was a very good example. It's just how you can't rationalize out of every single problem, how you're just going to figure it out or calculate your way out of a, I mean, that's just it was a very good example.
So it's the
I also love that.
thinking
I
of-
also love that, Rick. Just wanted to let you know. I love that.
Yeah, we all liked it, actually. Well, maybe I shouldn't say that. I liked it. Okay, it seems like many others did like it. So
So can I just say something to Joseph? What I think I hear you saying, it's the bottom line thinking of moderns.
Yes. It's there's this right answer and a wrong answer, and then there's nothing in between.
yeah.
That's exactly what it's saying, is that and everything that's really meaningful in between it's the world just doesn't work like that. It's go ahead. It's very noetic way of looking at the world. I mean, in a way.
Yeah, so, I just wanted to interject of what you said and support what you said. You know, mathematics, we now all think is the proof for what is real. And it's actually a very good measure. But Plato has it at the bottom of the divided line.
Right.
Is not the transcendental forms, which he had a problem getting to, but the forms were the highest form, and mathematics is not the highest form. It's actually below the divided line. I want you all to understand that, which means it's actually, according to Plato at least, a synthetic concept.
That's right. Yeah, it's part of what makes Plato hard to fully understand is that for all that he was consciously striving to be rational, he was immersed in a culture that had an enormous unexamined freight of gnostic wisdom. I think is how Kenneth Smith would put it, that they'd barely begun, they had not yet, really finished any kind of process of self-purification into noetic Vulcans. We've gone a lot further in that than they ever did. And so even a champion of reason like Plato still has a value system that respects all of these deeper things. And you can see that with him putting mathematics at the bottom. We would never put mathematics at the bottom. That's a very counter-modern thing to do because we've gone further down the noetic road than he did. As a result, part of the unexamined part of Plato's philosophy is the richest. It means that when he intellectualizes, he's doing so with all these rich resources of form that he just automatically brings to bear without thinking, because that's what you would do back then. And in doing so, we get to see how different it is for a classical Greek to try to be an intellectual than for a modern to try to be an intellectual. He doesn't have the same vacuum of values, right, that's necessary. There's certain kinds of conclusions you can only reach if you're sufficiently purified noetically so that you can start to make really big mistakes on a colossal scale. The Greeks still had this tether to the old wisdom. And this is what the current paragraphs in this essay are about, is the importance of that unexamined freight in establishing the basic axioms of a civilization. Stephen and then Donald. Go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, I was going to go out an angle here. I was probably just sort of going to ask some advice. What happens in student burnout? I mean, you've experienced this world. And what are some of the mistakes that students make? Now, the classic one I find is the student who doesn't want to get out of bed in the morning and figures I'll catch up with everything post midnight. That seems to be something that leads to a classic state of burnout.
Yes.
It's a bit like people who enjoy eating things for them that end up making them feel worse, that make them sick. What could you advise a student in this regard about the sort of regime you need to keep to indulge in studies without getting burnout?
Boy, it's so hard now. I mean, universities have changed since when I was a kid. Now, I when I grew up, I had this fantasy of the university as this kind of, community that was cultivating wisdom, and that by going there, we could be immersed in it and come to, know ourselves and the world better. But, so much of it has become so divorced from that, so very focused on specialization and technique. You can still find the other stuff, but funding has been slashed for the humanities, and requirements for humanities have been slashed. So what happens is, I think for a lot of people, they get into this environment in which isn't at all what they were expecting or dreaming of, but that they know they need in order to, succeed in their career. And so they're caught between a rock and a hard place, in which they're increasingly trying to compel themselves by their will to do things. And the problem is that the will has its limits. The more noetic you get, the less juice it has. You kind of need, as you pursue any kind of noetic field of study, you need to keep grounded in nosic activities that keep renewing your love of life, or else it's all going to fall apart. That's where the discipline comes from. That's where the juice for the discipline comes from, that side of things, which is typically neglected in a university curriculum.
Well, okay, do you have any insight into why a lot of people like to be night owls? I know so many. Now, the reason I get up a little bit early in the mornings is because I feel disgusted with myself if I sleep in. I feel insecure sleeping in. Whereas for a lot of people, that's a place of security.
Yeah,
and yet, it's a classic case of the philosopher Kynes. He was famous for getting up at about midday and staying up to all weird hours of the night. This can't be good for your health. And I'm just wondering what turns people into night owls, and why do they think that this solves their problem?
Well, I mean,
are you talking about college students, Stephen? Because
they're a classic example, but there's so many people I know, even people in their old age, that will only get up about midday and then go running around the world. But this isn't going to work for students, because usually your start time in the day for a student is you're in class at 9 o'clock. But their habit is to sleep past this.
Well, it's. I mean, I'm sort of thinking about my son. I mean, I think of how disciplined he was all through public schools, grammar school, junior high, high school. But then when he got to college, he was, I guess, to a certain degree, exploring and discovering himself and becoming an adult. And at that point, he would say, "Oh yeah, I stayed up all night and I'm just getting ready to go to bed at 7 a.m." And I think, I mean, that may be different with different students, but they're going through such growth process and discovering who they are and all that, that I certainly, one answer or one kind of diagnosis doesn't fit all in any way, form, or, yeah.
Yeah.
My comment on that, please. The first question about burnout, Stephen, is I'll tell you, when I was 17 and I was leaving my house to go to medical school, my father, he reminded me, because he knew it was going to be hard. He says, all work and no play makes Jill a dull girl. Mm-hmm. And that's how I learned to run. I started running for recreation way, way, way before it was popular, based on that advice. And that, because it was very, very hard. So you had to stay stable. And then the thing about diurnal rhythms, everybody has a different diurnal rhythm.
Yeah.
And it's just human variation. But when you're in a situation where you need to be at a point in time in a class at 9 o'clock in the morning, it's always interesting to see how much discipline you have to achieve your objective. And again, it's all about balance. I am right in that balance. You got to do enough just so you stay centered.
Yeah. The current research certainly backs out what Sharon's saying, that people come in different models. We have different diurnal rhythms. And I know it well because I'm a morning person. You know, I never set an alarm clock. I wake up at 5 something or 6 something or sometimes 4 something. Just that's when my body wants to wake up. My wife, by contrast, is absolutely not a morning person. She's a night owl, and that's just the way she's wired. You know, she by around about 8 or 9 at night, you know, I start really dragging. I'm just barely conscious. Where she's just getting going, her brain's percolating, and she's wanting to dive into, you know, let's plan the rest of our lives. Let's get into a philosophical discussion. What about this thing that happened in current events? And, you know, at that point, I'm just really like, what? You know, my brains have already gone to sleep without me. So
okay, I worry about civilization. I'm walking up the jet airliner, and every passenger says to me, "I'm just here for the ride." Okay, I walk up there, open the pilot door cabin, and I suddenly notice the cabin got hit by a meteor or something and is totally blown away. There's just air hissing out where the pilot's cabin is. And I just look at civilization this way, that every person I come across seems to think, well, I'm just here for the ride, and the train or the airplane's going to fly itself. And there's nobody in the pilot seat anymore except, well, I look at the sort of people you're getting as president of America lately, and I figure you must be able to do a little bit better than this. There's, you know, 340 million people in America, but beautifully, slightly less than perfect human beings created the American airplane. It must have been a genius that created the pilot seat. It exists. The guy who created it dies, and now any fool in American politics figures, I am God when I sit in the pilot seat.
Mm-hmm.
I just see that now where our culture is now a runaway train. There's nobody's effective sitting in the pilot seat. Only people who don't have the qualification for driving the train or flying the airplane. And us passengers are all just sitting there saying, well, I was only here for the ride.
Yeah, this is the crisis you're going to see in any late stage epoch. By the late stage of an epoch, the epoch has become a particular kind of conservative, where what it wants more than anything is people who won't rock the boat. So it doesn't cultivate the qualities that you need for leadership, but it still has to elect leaders. So it elects them out of, you know, people who are fundamentally followers. You get people who, or worse, you get opportunists who you know who race to the seats of power. They're not any better qualified; they're worse qualified than a follower would be, but they can't resist the opportunity to get into the seat. And by this stage in a civilization, the capabilities, the characterological and cultural capabilities required to be able to stop that from happening have largely been stamped out. And you get this enormous amount of the laws of history are starting to take the reins of the airplane and drive it where it's going to go for the rest of this particular arc. It's a difficult stage to live through, and it's not a coincidence that incidents of depression, for example, and other affective disorders are just epidemic all over the world. Because people, you're not the only one, Stephen. Almost everybody has the feeling that we grew up as children assuming that there were adults in charge, and then we grew up and looked around and said, where are all those adults that I thought were keeping us all safe and making sense of things? All I see are children in adult bodies wondering what the hell's going on. Donald and then Phil.
Well, we do live in the classic stage where all the people down the bottom hated the aristoi of their own era. So back in the 19th century, you had Metternich, who tried to preserve the system that was working, but the popularism hates the idea of the aristos above them. He wants to shoot the aristos, the popularist. he shoots the Aristus, and then he suddenly finds that there's nobody to steer the ship.
Yeah, this is a Greek concern. They talk about that in an unhealthy, self-antagonistic culture, the douloi resents the aristoi, and the aristoi have contempt for the douloi. And you see that going on now all the time in our pop culture. There's whole magazines and TV channels that just thrive on this particular dynamic. We've reached that stage. Donald and then Phil. Go ahead, Donald.
Yeah, I kind of like mathematics, and
I do too.
when I went to study philosophy, they told me I had to go study mathematics first.
Oh dear.
That was a typically Platonic thing.
Yes.
Because it's not that mathematics is philosophical. It's that it sort of tests your powers of abstraction or conceptualization. You know, if you can't do math, you can't do philosophy. Well, there are many kinds of philosophy you can do if you can't do math, but there are probably some that you can't do that are important.
Yes.
And as far as the university, as the Dean of Men explained to us on our first day, this institution is a repository of knowledge, since it strips whatever is known by its entering students and amasses it there.
Not true.
Wow.
So, and the thing, what Phil? You shake your head. We you know, this Dulik Banausik. The Banausik, you know, I see that they have this very instrumental reasoning. They find their end, and then they think towards it.
Right.
And their lack of scope. We've used that Greek word, makes a good modern word too, idiot, idiotes, is that they just can't see outside their own life. And
Right.
that's really the quality that disqualifies them from higher position within the state or the polis or whatever.
Yes.
You know, I would like to say something. This is intended kind of ironic. We just had our city council election here in Tempe, and we elected 3 new city council people. Simultaneously, as far as I can tell, they all supported one. There's about 47 acres of vacant land left in the entire city, and they want to turn that into a hockey rink if they can do it. And 2, their biggest concern was doing something for the homeless. And at no point was it ever, we've got 47 vacant acres. We could actually do something for the homeless.
Right. Right.
But we could actually put them somewhere, begin to provide facilities, have a homeless, you know, but no, they were all in agreement. Vacant land is for real estate development, and
then we wring our hands about the homeless.
Really for providing jobs for city employees.
Yes.
To extend services to the homeless. So
yes. Yes.
I don't know. That's just to me a case of this. This is a Banausik way of reasoning through things, and I think that's enough of the irony. But I did want to defend. Phil is quite right. Mathematics is at the bottom in the divided line. It's there for a reason. It's that first hurdle that the Guardians go through on a long training to see if they can, we can deal with abstract concepts like points, lines, planes,
right,
conic sections, regular figures. Now, can we deal with things like laws, people, states, relation? Do we have other powers above that?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what the training is. So they start. It's just a starting place.
Yeah.
Enough.
Foundational.
Yes, those who know calculus. No, the Greeks didn't have to know calculus. It was just Euclid, which is junior high or something.
Thank you, Donald.
I just want to make a quick moment to ask a question. You know, it's going off the topic just a bit. I'm sorry, but we've talked about, you know, everywhere, all these meetings I go to, they talk about the ancient Greece over and over and over, you know, the period of Aristotle, Socrates, Plato, you know, and all these playwrights, Euripides, Sophocles, blah, 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 blah. But then you don't hear about Greece after that period, within last 1,500 years, 2,000 years, or whatever. What happened to Greeks? What happened to Greeks?
Right?
I mean, like we talk about German philosophers or French philosophers, blah, blah, but you don't hear about Greeks doing anything contributing to civilizations after that. What is it?
The Macedonians took over Greece, and they weren't the philosophical people. And then the Romans conquered it all.
And they weren't a philosophical people.
Okay, they turned into Byzantines. They went from their dancing, prancing, butterfly Greeks and turned into cockroaches.
So, I mean, even within the last 1,000 years, you don't hear anything about Greeks.
No, just go and read up on the Byzantines and you'll be horrified.
That's 1,000 years of Greek history. Stephen's right. We don't teach much about Byzantium and Constantinople because of the split between the Western Catholic Church and the Eastern Catholic Church. The Roman Catholic Church hated the Byzantine Church for not being underneath it, but for being co-equal with it. And so they encourage people to not think much or talk much about Byzantium. And what that does is erase 1,000 years of Greek history from all of our consciousness, because Byzantium was the history right up until the fall of Constantinople when the Turks took it. And it's part of the reason why almost everybody in the West who gets philosophical education is under the misapprehension that the Library of Alexandria was burned down with all of its books and all of that knowledge was lost. We believe that because we didn't know that long before then, the library had been raided by other libraries that had stocked up their supplies of books with books that used to be in Alexandria. And one of the main places where all of that stuff ended up was the Royal Library of Byzantium. Constantinople and Byzantium was a center of learning for 1,000 years because they had all those books and scrolls from the Library of Alexandria. And they preserved a lot of knowledge. They did a lot of innovation in science and mathematics and philosophy. They basically invented the lowercase alphabet, which we then copied into the Roman. Right? They had it before we did. They did all kinds of things. They had a program of translating the old papyrus onto vellum scripts to preserve the works. Yes.
There was a whole massive program. Constantinople. This Constantinople effectively became the lifeboat of civilization.
Yes, yes. When we talk about the Renaissance, you know, one of the mistakes that I made earlier when we were talking about the Renaissance is I did emphasize the debt to the Arab world, What I did not adequately emphasize the debt to the Byzantine world. An enormous amount of the information that came flooding into Europe around the 1300s, 1400s, 1500s. Yeah, a lot of it came from the Arab world, but a lot of it also came from Constantinople. Prior to when the Western Church sacked Constantinople during one of its crusades, it was a great center of learning and knowledge.
Well, that's the Star Wars tragedy of the White Knight who goes off to do noble things and turns into a Black Knight.
Yes. Yeah, it's just a retelling of that, isn't it? So yeah, it's interesting. There's a lot to be learned. There's as Steve alludes, there's a hideous amount of political stuff to be learned from the history of Byzantium. A lot of backstabbing and infighting, a lot of destruction of classics, but side by side with that, there's also a lot of preservation of old knowledge. They had Greek fire, as far as we know, right up until Constantinople got sacked, and nobody else knew how to do it. We'd all forgotten how they did that kind of napalm-like stuff that the Greeks used to do. They preserved a lot of technology, basically. After that, for a while, they were caught up in the history of Islam until eventually you have to look to modern history to see Greek emerging as a modern state remarkably recently, and they're still struggling to get out from underneath a lot of messy history. It's not a center of enlightenment, but it is a living culture that's fighting through its own history, just like everybody is. Phil, and then Sharon. Go ahead, Phil.
Well, like Byzantium is where we got Roman law into contemporary law. So in some sense, that's true. And and actually continue. I mean, if you want to follow, Byzantium is now in Moscow. That's what it is. So in any event, I want to tell a kind of personal story that will perhaps address this long question. Mathematics was the only thing that got me into college because I didn't know English well enough. I couldn't read the test fast enough to complete it. So I accepted that part, but I couldn't read the questions fast enough to complete the science or the social science. So together, that was a very low score. And, not that I'm a great mathematician, but the only thing that got me into college was I scored 9 in mathematics. But when I got to college, I completely forgot about that, which maybe should have been a way for me to continue. But I had, I guess, an interest that was almost a very personal interest in the arts. And I remember when I later on decided maybe I should take the vocational aptitude and interest, the interest part test, and see what I score and have a kind of an objective evaluation of that. And when I got it back, I agree with it pretty much totally, score high in music, even though I had no musical talent because I love music, score high in art, score high in things such as, philosophy and, maybe even science. But it's like the humanities. I said, yeah, this is roughly right. And I even liked the way it was sort of like layered in such a way that the sequence was right. And then I looked below the line, what I call the divided line, and anything that has to do with money and finance, anything, it was off the chart like low. And I remember saying to myself, uh-oh. But
that doesn't bode well.
However, when you think about it, like if I was being rational as such, I would have said, yeah, maybe I should go into what I normally would because I'm a first generation immigrant, right? To do something practical. To go into arts was totally impractical.
Yeah.
I had the desire and the drive to do it. And so I kept that in mind. Like I got to keep an eye on this practical stuff, even though I wasn't going to go off the road and not pursue my interests. That was an inner drive of some sort. So I was centered. And what made it possible is another thing is like, I grew up poor.
Mm-hmm.
And growing up poor meant that I knew that many of things that I presume I might have needed and desire was unnecessary. So I consider myself, not then, but later on, that I was fortunate to be poor, which most people would say, this is really idiotic, right? That you were fortunate to be poor. Most people would say, well, how unfortunate I had, so unlucky, because I knew that wasn't that important. The third thing that was important was, my mom had left for Hong Kong in 1949, and we grew up with my grandparents. And my father, had in China, had legally taken up concubines, so he was not part of the family. I grew up not knowing him. I had no father, so I did meet him, but no father, so to speak. And when we came to America, my mom was so busy working, essentially as a draft animal to support us, that she was never around. Mm-hmm. So we had to grow up by ourselves. So I was quite independent in a sense, And so as a result, I had developed a kind of gyroscope that led me into the arts, that I was not detracted as much by the material needs. I was also somewhat independent, feeling that my gyroscope would steer me in the right way. So in some sense, that was way made me possible to attack the thing that was a stupid thing to do in this society. I mean, like, looking back, I kind of say, oh my God, like I did that. I was actually kind of stupid, but that did steer me. And I think that if people understood that they really had something they deeply care about, that it would be part of the gyroscope. The problem is most of us don't know what we actually want. And then we're distracted by all these material things in the world, all that, and say, well, maybe I ought to have that. And they're distracted and they become offset. The funny thing is when I went into art, what I thought was art turned out to be 170 degrees different than what I thought, which is like, that was interesting. I remember talking to the professor, said, that's what it, and he said, oh, you mean 180 degrees? I said, no. That would be too easy. Exactly.
Right.
170 degrees, just enough to keep you off kilter, like, and I had to relearn a whole new context of what art actually means, which was actually much more open than what I thought. And what I thought was, in some sense, a sophisticated kind of illustration, which turned out not to be art whatsoever. So that was interesting, that even the thing that I pursued turned out to not be the thing that I thought I was pursuing. But I was able to like readjust because I had enough confidence in my gyroscope to keep me on track rather than just like, oh my God, I got to turn 170 degrees, that sort of thing. So that was very, very interesting. And that would be a good piece of advice to anybody who's lost, is to find something you really care about. Care is the architecture for all the other things that will manifest this dimension of existence.
It helps a great deal.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it arises from the Gnostic side
Mm.
of our mind, that side that's concerned with immersion and feelings and memories and experiences. It's what makes discipline possible, to have something that we care about enough that we're willing to marshal our resources in that direction to overcome obstacles. This whole thing between pure will in the noetic sense and what it actually takes to generate the spirit required to even have discipline is something that Kierkegaard talks about a bunch when he talks about the way that the aesthetic personality, as it molds itself into a pure and pure noetic form, also lose all the wind out of its sails and can't figure out why it's happening, because it thought that this was the direction that would lead to greatest self-control. And it does, it just leads also to the greatest apathy. So you end up at this pinnacle of, I now completely control myself, except that I don't want to do anything anymore and therefore have no control at all. There's this, I went through that crisis in college. It was where I thought, I don't need to listen to my feelings. I can just make myself do what I want to do, what I think I should do, what I've decided to do. And the further I went down that road, the more depressed I got, and the less I was able to do things. And I had to turn it around by tapping back into, what do I actually care about? What am I passionate about, in order to get going again. So people who hang on to what they care about and what they're passionate about through their college experience do better, because now they've got some wind for their sails. Sharon, go ahead.
So I'd like to share one thing that I just got on the email. And it goes back to what Phil says about pursuing something that you really care about. I am extremely left-brained, and I'm trying to be a photographer in the club, and I can't see. And Phil knows what I'm talking about. You got to see the image in order to create it. So Phil, I entered 2 of my pictures, and one was a butterfly that I shot at Butterfly World here into the International Color Awards. You know what that is, right?
Yes.
And I got an honorary mention, and I am so proud of myself.
That's awesome.
Because I know nothing. And I don't know how to show you all the picture, but it was well done. So anyway, that they just sent me the email and I saw it. Anyway, but back to the text.
Yes,
I
please.
wanted to read these 2 sentences because I think it's what's happening around us now, where it says in the second paragraph of the paragraphs we're going to discuss this week,
yes,
it says, but the civilization or culture, if in decline, continues to control the way its subjects interpret its vitality and authority. And you could see that. Russia shut down all the free press.
yes.
And that's what Hitler did when he finally got control of Germany. The press was controlled by the government. It had a name, I forgot what it said. And the second part of it says, it projects a virtual universe of an intimate prospect of an infinite prospect for itself.
Yes.
Because few civilizations can conceive they may be mortal, historically conditioned, depletable in moral, political, or spiritual resources. And so he tried to project an image of winning with that rally. And that's why I said I find this all so fascinating, because I am living it, I am seeing it, if only I would understand it, as I try to understand it. So I want you to comment on that for me, Rick. Thank you.
Yeah, so, that's one of the things it's one of the reasons why Kenneth Smith goes back to the Greeks over and over. Because the classical Greeks were unusual in that they knew that they were burning the candle at both ends. They had seen the example of the Trojan War. They held it before themselves at all times to remind themselves of the great hazards of what they were trying to do. And they looked around and didn't see anybody else doing what they were trying to do. And from this, they concluded that not only were they mortal individually, but so was their whole civilization. And that they needed to be very, very careful not to hasten their own demise, which is why the Peloponnesian War and the wars that followed are such a tragedy in the Greek sense, because they they knew it and tried above all not to do that, and that's exactly what they did nevertheless, is do themselves in. But that issue of that you're talking about the way that even when things aren't going well, people are still part of that culture in the sense that they're thinking using the culture's own tools. And that means that if the culture is headed in the wrong direction, then most of the would-be, the people who want to fix it, the people who say, oh, I see what's wrong, here, let me fix it, they will also lead it in the wrong direction because they're still thinking within the frame of the culture itself. They can only see what that culture permits them to see. They can't think about the things that would go in an entirely different direction. They can only think in the direction the culture is already going. It's a weird contradiction because they don't feel like their thinking is constrained. They're not aware of they don't see any shackles, right? They feel like they're freely thinking. They would consider it a coincidence that their solutions all end up in the same pattern and that they can't seem to come up with a proposed solution that goes in a completely different direction, that they're not capable of thinking outside the scope of their civilization. This issue that the unseen thing guides us and compels us, and yet doesn't feel like it's guiding or compelling us, was of keen interest to the Greeks. We've talked before about Heraclitus's ethos anthropoi daimon, character is fate, and that he used that metaphor of the daimon specifically because, like an experienced horse and rider pair, the horse forgets the rider is there. The horse feels the nudge and thinks it's its own idea to go left or right, and because it's learned to so automatically respond to the rider that it forgets the rider is there. And Heraclitus is saying that is how our character rides us and guides us, even though our will believes that it's free and is freely choosing. It's freely choosing according to the nudges that came from its character. And the part that goes with that, where the deep paradox of that parable comes from, is that the same is true of the character itself. It's being ridden by its culture. You know, by the time it has become a character at all, it's already developed within the framework, the matrix or the womb of the culture. And so what the directions that it leads you are going to be typical of what that culture permits. Now, every culture has a certain amount of ferment within itself. It has a certain amount of conflict. So you can get a range of different ideas. It's not like everybody's thinking in a little Xerox line. There's a whole field of play for the kinds of things that people can think, what's thinkable and what's unthinkable. And some of the people within that range, they really hate each other and they believe they're at opposite ends of a pole. They don't understand how they're caught up within a unified system of thought that is perfectly able to handle contradictions within itself on those issues. But there's other issues that the two groups within the culture who think that they're enemies or opponents don't understand that they share in common because they're part of the same culture. There's ways in which, even in their attempts to resist each other, they're stereotypically acting out the culture's, patterns or demands. So this is the theme of this whole area that he's talking about. He has this quote a little further down after the W.H. Auden, not the first paragraph, not being conscious, but the second one. Once those ways of thinking, he's talking about the way that what holds the culture together is unconscious, but it's not any part of the unconscious. It's a specific part of what's unconscious, that there are these principles or themes or patterns or drives or values that act as strange attractors, and they act as fountains of organization that cause us to align around them. And those are the things that make us functional as a culture, regardless of what we wrote down in our constitution or in our laws or what have you. But because those parts are unexamined, what happens is cultures sort of sort themselves into two groups. There are cultures that put a great deal of stock and have a great deal of respect for the unexamined parts. What is tradition? What have we always done? And they will not mess with that very much. And so as a result, those cultures have a tremendous amount of momentum. They're able to hold themselves together. Now, they may drift out of sync with the world around them. They can have problems for that reason, but they're not likely to centrifuge themselves apart, because the respect for tradition means that, you know, they're only going to stray so far from the momentum of the core. But when you get these noetic cultures, these hyper Apollonian cultures, like the classical Greeks and like ourselves, they start to think that the unexamined life is not worth living. Or like Kant, they start to believe that we shouldn't be burdened by tradition or custom or religion. Everything should have to justify itself rationally. And if it can't, we should throw it out. And we should stick to what's purely rational and agreed upon. When cultures go through this phase, among the things they throw out are the things that are holding them together, because they don't know what's holding them together. It's part of that unconscious stuff that they haven't been able to bring to light. And so those unconscious things that are holding them together are not able to justify themselves rationally, because they didn't ever rationally agree on it. They inherited it from their forebears as habits and customs and values. So once a culture starts to rip all that old dead stuff out and throw it away, it starts to fall apart. This is the late stage of an epoch when it's doing this. It was for the Greeks. We could see that they were running out of history, and it's what's going on with us right now as well, as we're realizing that the value system that brought us into the modern epoch was still very medieval. There's a whole bunch about it that we can't stand, that we don't like, mixed in with the good stuff. We don't know how to separate the two. And so what's happening is, as we strip out all of this stuff, Stephen talks about this from time to time, as we say, well, we absolutely have to get rid of Christianity. We're going to rip all that out as the basis. We don't realize that we're throwing out things that we don't have a replacement for. So we didn't know that that was part of what Christianity was bringing to the picture. We see the bad parts of late medieval corrupt Christianity. We don't see the good parts that were in there, that were part of our foundation. And so as we rip it apart, we're trying to guess or decide intellectually or systematically what to replace it with. And we're not doing a good job at that, because we never really did understand what was holding us together, right? So there is a way in which hyper Apollonian cultures tend to be short-lived once they reach that stage, because they start pulling apart things they don't understand very well, that they can't understand very well, that are far more complex than anything that a human ego or intellect is capable of rising to the level of comprehending. And so we get a lot of baby with bathwater type reforms, where we do as much damage or more in fixing things. You know, it's one of the reasons I'm an incrementalist in some ways. You know, I've in medicine and in medical software, I've seen how far you can get if you don't ever throw everything out and start over. If you say, I'm not going to try to architect an entire system. I'm not going to try to design an entire system from scratch. That's not possible. But what I can do is focus on what are single broken points in the system, the ones that are the least tolerable. And that's where we focus our efforts to fix things, because then we're limiting the damage that we do as a side effect of what we don't understand. We give ourselves time to respond. It's part of the theme that he's talking about here, is the debt that we have to the unconscious, the debt that we have to the irrational, that makes it possible for us to even have a civilization, and that it is in our nature as moderns not to be able to acknowledge that debt, not to want to acknowledge it, certainly not to be able to restructure our governments to respect it, because they're so Apollonian that they only respect what's explicit, and anything else they think is fair game for profit. And you can render it down for quick turnaround on profits. So you can see him talking about that here when he talks about, you get to a stage where, you know, a civilization has ripped apart its own core values, but it's got so much momentum and inertia that it keeps going on anyway. It just doesn't understand that it's not holding itself together anymore.
I can't help but think what you're saying right now, Rick, and I can't help but keep thinking about what's going on with Ukraine and Russia, and how what you're saying could be, I don't know.
It's the challenge for the Soviet Union and the United States that both countries for over half a century bet everything they had on propping each other up, right? Why does the US do what it does? It does it because of the great enemy, the Soviet Union. If they have nukes, we have to have nukes, right? If they've got military bases, we have to have military bases. If they escalate, we have to escalate. Both countries got themselves to where their entire political economy was dependent upon military escalation in a Cold War type scenario. When the Cold War fell apart, we liked to point and laugh at the Soviet Union and say, haha, you broke up, we win. The Berlin Wall fell, we must have won. But the truth is it provoked a crisis in both countries.
Mhm.
It's incredibly expensive to maintain massively bloated militaries. And nuclear weapons are very difficult to keep safe, right? They tend to degrade and fall apart. And that's exactly what you don't want them doing, like when they're at home on your home base, in your soil, in your aquifers. In Washington State, we've got Hanford. And all of those nuclear storage tanks are leaking. All of them. I mean, there's radioactive water in the Columbia River. You know, it gets into the salmon. There's high cancer rates downwind from Hanford. Like, there is an enormous price that we're paying to maintain this state of readiness for nuclear war, and Russia's paying it too, right? They bet the farm on that strategy. When that strategy fell apart, they're still stuck with all the costs, even though they don't have any of the benefits. So the question is, when the world has moved on, as it has from both the US and the Soviet Union in terms of our military strategies, but you can't seem to stop playing the old game. You can't, like, our country would never allow the Beltway to be disassembled and all those military contractors to stop making weapons and go do something productive. That would never be allowed in the United States. It's not going to happen. They're going to keep building weapons because that's what they know how to do. And they're going to keep leaning on Congress people to vote for, you know, let's get involved in every conflict that we can imagine, because it justifies doing more military spending. We're caught, just like Eisenhower warned us, in a trap where we can't stop spending money on this thing, even though now it's obsolete. I mean, so the challenge for both countries is, what are they supposed to do? It is not surprising that Russia's response to the scenario is, let's invade. We do the same thing, right? We did that in Afghanistan, we did it in Iraq, we did it in Syria. We're looking at Ukraine thinking, this might be scary, but we might have to do it. You know, there's a big argument happening right now in the halls of power in the United States about whether or not to try to escalate this into a hot war, because there's a lot of money to be made. I mean, sure, it might result in World War III and the death of everybody, but look at the money. So it's why, but on the other hand, there are people at that level of power who absolutely do not want a hot war, who are absolutely clear on the fact that that's going too far. It would cut into profits. And so they're sort of negotiating. There's these arguments going on, trying to negotiate what our response is going to be to Ukraine. All this stuff, you're right. You're right, Jenny. All this stuff goes right back to this question of the unexamined parts of what's holding a culture together, and, you know, whether it's capable of asking the penetrating questions that allowed it to break free of the old societies in the first place. Can it ask those questions about itself now, or is it trapped within its own momentum and inertia, unable to respond, unable to change anymore and respond to the environment around it? Phil, you got your hand up.
And so in your conversation, though, you're not thinking about what Putin has started might end up with the entire Earth being destroyed by nuclear war?
Well, he's betting we won't.
What's that?
He's betting that we won't.
Putin is betting that we won't do that?
Yeah, he's betting that we won't engage in a nuclear war. And it's probably a good bet. It's probably a good bet. But of course, he's also betting that the Ukraine doesn't turn into a giant mud field during the spring and all of his tanks are going to sink into fields of mud. And so far, he's losing that bet. I don't know how closely you've been following, but there's a saying going around, just like they say, never invade Russia in winter. They're saying, evidently, there's another lesson: never invade Ukraine in spring, because it's just raining and it's all mud and all kinds of military equipment's bogging down. Phil,
That's good news. That's good news. Okay.
Yeah, right. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, this leads me to the question about the nature of the visible and the invisible. The invisible is a surplus that actually gives us information that reveals itself. The problem, however, that complicates this, and I don't disagree with you, but complicates this, is the replacement of the invisible with the spectacle.
Yes.
Right? So therefore, the invisible truly become invisible because the spectacle has replaced it.
We watched that.
And I would say that the war in Iraq, now, even though I'm misplacing juxtaposition of Bush Jr. with Bush Sr., you can't forget about the 1,000 points of light, which is, that's the spectacle that allows us to do what we do.
Yeah.
So I want to read this thing that I just wrote, an email I wrote to my financial advisor, asking him a question. I think that actually will shed light on this, the nature of the visible and the invisible and the spectacle and so forth. Steve, I would like to ask you a question and opinion on your thoughts about the collateral demands, especially in the after hours in regard to the option trading. I was watching your man, Jeff Snyder, who is a theorist for his company, and Elon Kolonowski talk about the shadow money that is beyond the control of the central banks.
Mm-hmm.
That is to say, there are off-market deals in which has to do with money promises in relationship with collateral that might have to rebalance, especially in a volatile market, which must be rebalanced. During the discussion, I realized that part of the rebalancing might not be dark money, but might have to do with option trading to settle margin calls. If so, that is not dark money, but a balance of debt in plain sight as part of the market itself, having to do with excessive speculation and the need to be rebalanced. If that is the case, why don't the market at least rein in the option market with the uptick rule? If they feel it is necessary to even have option tradings at all, which is one point where the market is encouraged excessive in the market due to speculation, indicative of doing the market from a investment vehicle to a gambling house. I mean that it is actually a part of the market that puts the unsuspecting investor at a disadvantage to such speculative instruments. It would even be worse if the general public begins to engage in such speculation, such as through Robinhood, turning them into fish to be killed in a barrel, except instead of chasing the apparent cause, they don't even know that they are fish, even in a barrel, but believe that they are happy hunters, but really waiting to be shot. The market has become a tragic comedy, and so has our civilization. If this matter is at all correct, it seems to be a perfect setup for the greedy bastards in the market, taking advantage of unexpecting public and such things as after-hour pump and dump schemes will eventually sink the economic ship, and that indicates the cynicism of our civilization, which deserve to go down with the count. If so, how is that? How is it that I, who don't really understand the intimate relationship of the market and the economy, can smell the dead fish of this civilization while the government does not, or knows, but not fix the situation, but simply let the party go on as Rome burdens. Have we really built our civilization on the foundation of rotting fish? If so, America is indeed in decline and deserves to go down. Down goes Joe Fraser. That was the end of it.
Who wrote
And
this?
he actually agreed with me, except he also said, of course, the good part is that it allowed for such innovations as iPhones and all that kind of stuff, right?
Right.
So he's hedging, but he actually agrees with me. It's already a very cynical market that drove the divergence between the real economy and the money markets. So in some
Who's the
sense,
author of that?
what
you just read?
I wrote that. I wrote that to him, asking him, like, how is it that I, who am not an expert in this, could smell the dead fish
Yeah.
as a foundation of our economic structure, rather than the true foundation built with solid rock.
Right.
What did he tell you to do?
He agreed with me. And he says, he said that, I could read that part, but I won't. He agreed with, he said, Glass-Steagall, he really agrees that it should have been enacted and that it should be reined in. But, and then he emphasized, but there is a plus side, which of course is true. We've gained many, many things that we would not have. But even those things are hooked too. Like, you have to have the new iPhone. You can't have the old iPhone. That's obsolete, right? So you create new wants. So even in that system, in the positive system, you create new wants rather than, as I said, you really don't need it. So
there's a hardware-software feedback loop in which people write software that absolutely depends upon the capabilities of the new, more powerful hardware. And so if you don't upgrade your hardware, you also can't run modern software.
Yeah.
And that's not an accident. Bill Gates and the Apple founder, among others, both openly admitted that was a way to drive the market.
Yeah.
Planned obsolescence, right? And so it kind of goes beyond wants. Because, for example, there was I think in the last 10 years, there have been some pushback against people criticizing the homeless for having cell phones. And the pushback is, you understand, if they don't have cell phones, they can't get jobs. That, they don't have a landline because they don't have a home. So if they don't have a cell phone, literally nobody can call them. And the days of putting ads in newspapers for wanted and waiting for weeks for people to show up, that's not how anybody hires anymore. They expect quick response.
Yeah.
And if they can't reach you on the phone, they won't hire you.
Well, that's why they're living under a bridge.
It's the only way out of homelessness. You have to have a cell phone. And yet at the same time, you have people critiquing it as a luxury and saying, oh, they're not really poor. If they were really poor, they wouldn't have a cell phone. Well, back in my day, when we were poor, it starts to become this competition for who's poor enough to deserve, mercy or any kind of consideration. But, that's the thing, is that we changed the world. The market realized that if it's stuck entirely to optional things, people wouldn't always buy as much as the market wanted them to buy. And so restructuring society to take things that might have been optional and turn them into necessities has become a major driver of profits.
That's the spectacle.
Yeah, I mean, it's part of the spectacle. Yeah. Well, and it's
and
not.
So none of these people are environmentalists by any means, are they? Because all these obsolete cell phones and this and that and devices everywhere, all ending up in landfill. Aren't they ending up in landfill, or are they getting recycled? I don't know.
Yeah, a
But,
small percentage of them gets recycled. But even if they were all recycled, you'd have to go to China, to the towns where they manufacture these things, and look at some of the lakes and rivers, which are so full of heavy metal runoff from the factories that they're completely dead. Nothing can live there. And it may be centuries or thousands of years before anything ever will.
Well, I
because-
took my computer to upgrade the memory, and the guy says you can't do it anymore because
right.
they won't even allow you to swap in, so you can't repair it. You just
Right.
have to get a new one. I mean,
Right.
really, and I really got very angry at that, So
Well,
you
I have a
couldn't even
question.
reset.
I have a question then. So I have an old Gateway desktop computer. So if I were to just throw it away, let's say, because I don't know how to destroy the hardware inside what's in the computer. Like, I don't know what personal information is in there anymore or anything. So I shouldn't be afraid that somebody could take it and compromise my information nobody would ever do such a thing anymore. It just, nobody does it anymore. So should I just throw it away? And
it's so much, if they want to compromise your security information, it's so much cheaper to hack you than it is to try to physically get their hands on your computer. They'll use your internet
hack me in my new laptop that I'm using right now, for example. It's much easier to do it that way.
I mean, almost everybody who wants to break through security does it through network connections. So it's so much safer and easier for them. And also they can try simultaneously hacking hundreds or thousands of different computers, and maybe most of them are secure, but they get through somebody. It's more efficient for their time than actually going to dumps and looking for old computers or robbing people's houses. That's too time consuming.
Okay, thank you for that. Yeah,
sure, but you don't have to throw out your computer. There are businesses that will recycle computer parts. There's some in Seattle. I'm sure there are in where you live as well.
So I need to Google them. Okay.
Yeah, just Google them. You'll find them. They're finding uses. Stephen, you got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah. I've seen this example. I've always enjoyed McEvity's penguin atlases of history. If you must have seen them at some point.
Yes.
Well, I always remember, this was originally created in the late 60s, and this was a line, that the back in the 4th century, the Ostrogoths were gradually creeping across the Ukraine. Somewhere in the region of what's now Stalingrad, they bumped into the Huns, who were a hornet's nest. Suddenly, bang, these big, powerful barbarians that the Romans feared were crushed. It's a bit like this, the maid came up to the Roman emperor and she said, that big barbarian you're always scared of, Hagar the Horrible. At the moment, he raced in and he's hiding in our washing basket. He's scared of something out there called the Huns. And the Romans all got together and said, oh, don't worry about that. We'll just buy them off like we've done with all the other barbarians in the past. We've had the answers that have worked for centuries. And it's amazing that I just recall that little bit of history. And there was the West prancing along, dancing along. We'll just get a little bit closer. We'll just waltz up a bit closer to Vlad. And then bang. Hey, what's going on? What's wrong with Putin? Can't he see the Western Enlightenment? And Putin would go, yeah, we've had 2 doses of it already. There was the French Revolution, Napoleon. He came along to wipe us out. And that other dude, Hitler, he came along with his Western Enlightenment and tried to wipe us out. Yeah, we've seen you guys from the West twice before and you tried to wipe us out both times. Now you're prancing up with your new philosophy, and you're just the same old wolves in a new rudimentary animal clothing, trying to hide who you really are. This seems to be the attitude that the Russians have towards us. They can't pick up that there's something in the Russians that's just not on the same page with the West.
A lot of Vikings in Russian ancestry. Not well known by a lot of people who don't study history. Vikings spent a lot of time in Russia. It's named after the Rus.
Putin, can't you see our wonderful enlightenment? Can't you see that we're all going to work together to create the great, wonderful world? What's the matter with Putin? You must be insane. All the newspapers, every one of them are saying Putin suffers from a mental illness. They're all psychoanalyzing him.
Yes, yes. Well, I mean, I think at this point, none of us knows how this is going to come out is the thing. So we're, as much as our education and upbringing has taught us that it's our obligation to accurately predict objectively the truth of what's going to happen next, in all honesty, whatever it is, it's just going to happen to us. It's not something we're going to control. We're sort of all of the big countries at this point, all the successful modern democracies are increasingly at the point where the momentum of the conflicts of interest and the systems of conflicts of interest that have them in their grip are stronger than what any political party or new political movement can accomplish. And so we're sort of, like you were saying metaphorically earlier, Stephen, we're sort of along for the ride, whether we like it or not. And that strategy only works for so long, right? What makes a living, we talked before about organic order, what makes an organic system alive and vital is that it accurately senses the world around it and changes to respond to it and adapt. And when you can't do that, when you're gridlocked with conflicts of interest to such an extent that you're primarily being motivated by momentum instead of by kind of living feedback loops, then instead of being governed by the rules of life, you're governed by the rules of entropy and gravity. So we'll see what's going to happen. But I'm basically saying, in a short sense, what he says in all these paragraphs that follow. He's saying it, Kenneth is saying it in a more detailed way when he's talking about what it is that holds a culture together when it's healthy. Why is it able to function when it's able to function? And what is it that gets lost that converts a culture to the stage in which it's no longer able to sense and respond appropriately, when it's more obsessed with its own internal balances of power and obligations and piles of money than it is with what's actually happening in the world. Its value system becomes askew. It's the interesting thing is, during the rise of a culture, if it succeeds, it has no choice but to have been sensing what's around it and responding to it. The fact that it can do that better than the old guard, the old system, is what allowed it to rise in the first place. So it's part of why the organismic life cycle that Hegel alludes to and that Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and Smith and others are talking about, it's why it's not just a metaphor, that it undergoes a transformation due to its own success, where it becomes more obsessed with its own internals and stops paying attention to what's going on around it. And the extent to which it does that, it becomes less organic and more mechanical and starts to transform itself from something that was once living and vital to something that eventually is just dead momentum carrying forward, full of contradictions.
There was a French philosopher who was warning, I can't find him again, I read what he said, and he said this, that we're living in a world where people will see the material benefits of Western civilization and love that very much, but completely forget the spirit that created Western civilization in the first place. And not understanding that spirit, the results are going to be tragic.
Yes.
They will want the material, give us the mobile phones, everything like that. And this is what other countries are doing outside the Western sphere. Oh, this stuff's great, man. Give us more mobile phones. But absolutely no understanding of how that came to be. Not interested. We only want the results. We don't want the patterns of knowledge which led to that result.
There's a Gilbert Murray quote about this, where he talks about, and he, of course, he was writing in the early 20th century, where he's saying, one of the things that you can see from learning history is that there were periods in history when the only way to live a comfortable life was to have really been on top of your game and really understand the principles about how people have to relate to the world. But we became so successful that it became possible for large numbers of people to never get that education about, what is demanded of us, as people, to be able to relate to each other and to the world in a healthy, sustainable way. And so you get people who he says are of no particular virtue, and yet they're able to live seemingly comfortable lives and seem to be normal. The thing about this Gilbert Murray quote is, until you know the significance of all this stuff, until you know about the life cycles of epochs and civilizations, it might sound like he's saying it's a good thing. Look at all the people who are able to live normal lives, even though they don't have any particular virtue. Isn't that good? And what Gilbert Murray is saying, no, that's not good, because it means that they're not getting the education they need in order for the culture to be alive. And when you have
how many people can sit on the horse of civilization? There's always room for one more. It's the pack animal of civilization, the donkey. Oh, that donkey's been good for putting tons of weight on it already. Here's a few more tons from me.
Right.
They're all consumers. They all are using and are not interested in building.
And it's not an accident that they're that way. The reason that they're that way is we've reached the stage of the civilization where it doesn't want builders, doesn't want boat shakers, hand biters. It doesn't want anybody to shake up the system, because everybody has these giant pots of money and power that, more than anything else, they're afraid of losing. And they would let anything happen other than to lose their current investment. And that includes changing the way that we educate people, and the way that we enforce laws, and the way that we inform people, so that instead of raising people who have the virtues necessary to craft a civilization, you create generations of consumers who won't rock the boat.
Well, even worse now, we have a world of people in the non-Western world, which have got mobile phones, and they look at the West, oh, you live like the Brady Bunch, fantastic. I want a piece of this. But they get here and they're disappointed.
Well, yeah. Same thing happens to school kids when they grow up. They're like, okay, I'm going to get an education and I'm going to buy a house. And all the realtors laugh and laugh and laugh. You will never buy a house, not anymore. That was what your parents and grandparents did. It's going to take 8 or 9 of you to team up together to get into an apartment, let alone a house. One of the things that has been talked about during the COVID pandemic is the way enormous numbers of people just stopped working. And there was a great deal of gnashing of teeth and rending of garments about, well, what do we have to do to be mean enough to people to get them to work again? We're too soft on these people. If only we whipped them more and were crueler to them, then they would all go back to work. Of course, what they're missing is all these people realized that they had been going through, all kinds of torment for a dream that their parents and grandparents could have, but that they're never going to have. They're never going to own a house. Many of them are never going to pay off their educational debt. And the first time they get a serious illness, they'll be bankrupt for the rest of their lives. So they look at this prospect and say,
well, it's deferred happiness.
I'm to work all my life for that. That's not the promise. That's not worth working for. So they say, why don't we just sit on the sidelines and see what happens? Right?
Well, okay, Frankenfurter promised his minions nothing in abundance as their reward.
Now we're quoting Rocky Horror Picture Show. Yes. Anyway, so there is this way in which a civilization at its peak overestimates its own power, right? It has defined powers in ways that make sense to it, but that are not binding upon nature. And so it congratulates itself on its big piles of money or its great stocks of weapons or what have you. And then it's surprised to find its tanks sinking into fields of mud when it goes to invade another country, because that wasn't part of the schema. That wasn't part of the recipe. Similar things happened when Napoleon invaded Russia. He had the greatest army in the world, the most technologically advanced, and yet the farther he went, the fewer people he had. I think I shared a year ago this graphic that shows in one single diagram the dwindling of Napoleon's army until he finally gets back home to Paris with just a scant few thousand people after setting out with the greatest army in history. And it's because when you are in a civilization at its peak, just past its peak, you've become so inwardly focused that you've lost touch with the parts of reality that are still binding upon you. But when you go march out to try to do great things with your power, now reality has the opportunity to act upon you. And it doesn't act upon you according to the schema that you learned in school or in your military briefings. It acts upon you according to its own schema, which includes mud, which includes cholera, which includes not being able to get clean water. It includes all kinds of things you didn't account for. And next thing you know, all of your power has seemingly worked against you. This is, again, that echo of the classic structure of a Greek tragedy. You know that you've reached the reversal stage when all of your faculties work against you. The more you dig, the deeper your hole gets. And yet, since digging is the only technique you were taught, you think that the solution to the hole you're in is to dig more efficiently. And you can't see that it is your very strength that has become your weakness at that point, because it's pointing you in the wrong directions, like the man with the hammer who thinks, I can solve every problem by nailing. And if the problem is that you've nailed up too many things around you and you can't get out, and you try to solve it by nailing up more things around you, you're just building your labyrinth further. And you can't see that that's what you're doing, because you've interpreted the world in a way that this hammer has to be the answer. This is where the superpowers are at this stage. So, this isn't meant to be depressing. I know that it is for those of us living through it. The point of this is to be able to look and say, maybe we should put down the hammer and figure out what other tools we should be developing, what other views of the world, what other understanding should we be developing, other relationships should we be developing that can endure even if this civilization does not endure. Even if this collapses, what matters? We should be investing in clean water. We should be investing in fertile soil. We should be investing in pollinators, food, clean air, how to do housing, right? The basics of life are necessary regardless of which governments come or go.
And, we need to have a huge conference with all these tech executives and say, you got to find a way to not pollute the environment the way you are, what is it? Obsolescence built into these technologies. Is that what you said earlier?
Planned obsolescence.
Planned obsolescence, yeah.
I'm afraid this is a repeat.
What's
it's
that?
a repeat of the idea. This was the French solution, always. Let's learn how to be Olympian swimmers before we actually go out in the ocean. And unfortunately, the British beat them. That they couldn't compete with the British because the British actually went into the ocean and learned to swim and become champion swimmers. And the French ended up losing most of the time.
Well, let's do the final comments and then we'll wrap up for this week, and we'll move on next week. So Phil, then Donald. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I actually in part agree with Steve, but I find the problem is that it was in the onset of the liberal revolution, right? We were charged with a dual mandate. And that dual mandate was to liberate the human spirit, the spirit itself, and to liberate capital for the material goods. And it seems proper, but what always become suspicious of, the beginning both of the American Revolution and the French Revolution, particularly the French Revolution, I remember checking out the oath of the tennis court. I said, like the peasants were part of the revolution. They were storming the Bastille. But the middle class, the upper middle class at that point, the money people, they were the ones in the oath of the tennis court. We will not give up the power until we get all power instead, right?
Yeah.
The peasants were nowhere to be found in the oath of the tennis court. This is why with every subtext, depends who writes it. Every text, there's a subtext and that subtext is beholding to the writer of the text. right? And so therefore, in a sense, once you have this dual mandate, and they did have the dual mandate, it was about the liberation of the human spirit. But unfortunately, the hidden subtext, which was always there, I would call it actually not the subtext, the pretext was there, and it eventually undermined it because it kind of know the control of the money, of capital, was going to eventually dominate the liberation of the human spirit. And we are seeing that more and more because the pretext allowed the ruling class to enact the sort of not only the structure, but the spectacle that sustain it and replacing, like I said, the id to the surface. So you are satisfying both the concept and the id. And all you have is the plenty of the market that end up destroying the world. And in some sense, like, I think once you understand that, then you understand that in a sense, I say the dimensions of existence have been robbed by another dimension of existence, right? Like I said, just try not working. Those people who are lying flat now, thinking that they could overcome this, in several years, they'll be finding themselves living under a bridge. So that's a delusion as well. So we are trapped in this system, even when you want to rebel it against it, because they got you under the vice. And you might have recognized, like I said, the invisible, but like I said, lying flat is not going to do it.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Phil, the good bridges are already all taken.
Well, a leaky bridge then, okay?
A leaky bridge. And Donald.
Yeah, I kind of wish there were some examples, but at the same time, there really can't be. When Kenneth says, you know, each epoch has its presuppositions that are invisible to it, that we're fish and they're our water, or whatever, or I think Hegel said at one point that the job of philosophy is to think the unthought. Is that maybe our homework should kind of be, what might some of these presuppositions look like if we could think them, if we could be philosophical and get to them, you know, because they would need to be presuppositions probably shared by the Chinese, the Russians, the Europeans, and I mean, they would have widespread currency. So they wouldn't be just our current political differences.
Yeah.
Although, to show my true colors, perhaps, when we're dealing with people like Putin, I often wish we were Romans and that our leaders had actually killed people. I would feel better about them being in charge, knowing that they had actually fought at some point, you know, because Putin, he can clearly outbluff us, I think.
You mean something like that, or something like in Et tu, Brutus kind of concept? Et tu, Brutus, remember that play?
I don't think he's thinking assassination.
No, not assassination. I'm thinking everyone wants to talk to Putin. We need to have a discussion. We need to clarify our ideas. I think we need to blow up his tanks, shoot down his airplanes, and kill his men, like a good Roman emperor would do.
Hey, Donald, thank you, Donald. Generalissimo, Donald.
No, I'm not saying, but I think before, you know, I mean, But there's a
Do you
quote.
wanna-
There's a
Do you
quote.
want to? Do you want to move on to exterminating all of Russia to remove
No,
the threat
no,
forever?
no.
Sure.
I'm
You're sure once you've taken back the Ukraine, you won't get that temptation.
No.
Look, if we only get rid of Russia, the problems are all over. Because that's what the previous two guys tried to do.
No, I'm just saying in this context, you can threaten and bluff Putin all you want. Hope is not something that Putin has or whatever. He is a materialist. He will change his mind to reflect the material situation on the ground. And as long as his army is in being, I think he will fight it.
Well, I'm just wondering, I'm probably wrong, but I get the strange feeling that maybe Putin's some sort of a mastermind and the Ukraine is the bait and you're going to go straight for the bait.
Yeah.
No, it can't be. It can't be. There's nothing smarter in the universe than you.
No, I know what you're saying, but I'm saying I don't think Putin is being subtle. You can talk.
They've laid the cheese down for you, and you are the mouse that cannot say no.
I think I'm going to step in at this point and say, I'm sure our Putin debates will continue.
Right. I would like to say, I would. The serious point here.
Yeah, go ahead.
Is I think that we have that leadership, just as we've talked here, whoever's leading the West needs real knowledge of the material conditions for maintaining a civilization. There's a quote I heard long ago, probably falsely attributed to Orwell, that says people sleep peacefully in their beds at night only because rough men stand ready to do violence on their behalf. That for all the niceness and the sweetness and the let's meet in Poland and let's go to Paris and all this, it's going to be some rough men doing violence in the night, which will probably solve the Ukraine situation.
Don't we have that already? We have mercenaries.
We have mercenaries. I don't understand why he cannot be charged as a war criminal.
Well, he can't be arrested anyway.
Well, why?
He's a sovereign head of a country.
We've gone after other people in the past, Saddam Hussein. We've gone after Osama bin Laden.
Well, they have to take over their country or they have to leave it and get someplace where they can be arrested.
Why are you guys so upset about the Ukraine and Afghanistan never mattered?
Well, it's
lesser human beings than the Ukrainians for some strange
Let me say, this is very personal to me. A guy I worked with said his mother's uncle died in a concentration camp in the Ukraine in World War II. He got drunk and fell out of a guard tower.
That's it.
That's a joke. That's a joke.
We were not expecting that. I think you got us all.
That's it.
Literally, you got all of us. None of us expected that.
So no, I don't. But I mean, the other thing is, it's yours. Have it. But I just don't see Putin as somebody you talk to.
Well,
but
I'm glad Afghanistan was never the trigger for World War III. That we could just sit there and blithely let the Russians invade it, and then let the fanatics take it over, and then let the US invade it, and they lost out and left. I'm glad for all those decades we didn't push the button because of Afghanistan, but Ukraine's worth it. Let's push.
I'm gonna since we're 15 minutes
I'm not saying it's worth it.
Okay,
I'm gonna put a stop to this discussion for today.
Please.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Rick.
We'll have plenty of opportunities to
put me out of my misery.
Okay, all right. Thank you.
Rick, what are we doing next week?
I have an evil plan for next week. My plan is this. If you guys have other parts of chapter 3 in the remaining text, it's a couple pages of text left. If there's anything else in there that you guys want to talk about, you better come prepared next week. Because if you guys don't bring things up next week from the rest of this, I'm going to move us on to chapter 4.
All righty then.
And one last question, Rick. Could you tell me the flowering plant in your backyard one more time, please?
That's a red flowering currant.
Currant, you mean like the fruit currant?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
It's
Okay,
native to
thank
the
you.
Pacific Northwest, and it
And
blooms
Rick,
very early.
I like wines from the Columbia Valley, so thanks for telling me about the nuclear activity.
Okay. All right.
You
That's
can
what
mix
it is.
your red currant juice with your wines, your
Yeah.
white wines, and make a kir or whatever the French call it.
Yeah.
We
Okay.
can make currant jam and jelly. Okay.
I don't know it.
Okay, all right. So I'm coming prepared for next week. Any paragraph you want to discuss in the rest of 3, and you promise me you'll try to put up the rest of those.
Yes. Yes. Starting tomorrow, I'm going to start working with David to get the rest of the series up.
But if
Oh.
not, you have my email address. I know you do. It's somewhere on the meetup site.
Well, I got to get it all into text form anyway for the book. So, I might as well help him get it up on the website. David's done an enormous amount of work by himself trying to get this stuff transcribed. So
Thank you, David.
Contributed.
You know,
Thank you,
if you need
David. Thank you.
if you need a proofreader or anything when you get it all together,
I will take you up on that.
I'd love to have one more shot at reading the whole thing.
You got it.
Okay,
So
guys,
next
see
week.
you next
Okay,
week.
thank you.
Right.
Thank you,
Bye.
Rick. Thank you,
Bye-bye.
David. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.